we are. Let me,
New Mexico Water Dialogue meeting, the next 50 years, envisioning New Mexico's water future. It's really exciting to have all of you with us. This is a year like none other, which has been said so many times it need not be said anymore, but it is having its impact on the water dialogue and our meeting this year. Obviously, we're online on a screen in little boxes instead of being in person at the Pueblo Cultural Center, which we all really loved for the last 26 years. And especially the lunch, which we're sorry to do without. So what we have done is created an online meeting, and it will take place this morning and then again tomorrow in the morning and the afternoon. I'll go over the agenda a little bit later, but I just wanted to welcome everybody. Also wanted to thank very much Virginie Pointeau. Virginie has done all of the registration, the technical side of this. It's been a huge job and we're in really good hands. And also Jeffrey Sampson, who's running all the slides for us and will do all of that part, and the entire dialogue board, which is all volunteer and just the best group of big-hearted people you can imagine. So the spirit of the dialogue is inclusive. All voices matter, all voices need to be heard, deserve to be heard. We can learn an enormous amount from each other, and we can have that same spirit online as we have had in person, and we are about to prove that. So Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you. Jason is the president of the New Mexico Water Dialogue Board, has been since, I think, 2013. So we just don't let go of Jason, I'm afraid. Jason, thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you, Lucy, and good morning, everybody. Yate Bina, that is how we say good morning in Navajo. My name is Jason John. I am the director of the Department of Water Resources for the Navajo Nation. I've been with the Navajo Nation since 2001. First, I wanted to thank all the board members for all the work that they've done throughout the past 6 months or so in putting together this meeting. For a large part, almost all of that time, I was not really able to participate in the dialogue meetings because of the ongoing pandemic on the Navajo Nation. And I was needed there every day to help plan and coordinate water projects to be funded through the CARES Act, and then to also manage ongoing operations for the Navajo Nation in terms of water resources, for irrigation projects, livestock systems, water construction projects, and things like that. So I was quite busy, and I just wanted to really thank the dialogue board members for stepping in and really taking the lead in my absence during that time. So I just wanted to say that bit. We are currently in an ongoing drought that started basically back over a decade ago, but more recently it has restarted back in 2018. And it really, if you're not in water resources, you really don't pay attention to the data and the details of what's been happening over the past couple of years with this ongoing drought. But it is beginning to take a large toll on our environment and the water resources throughout the state and the Southwest. On the Navajo Nation, we consider ourselves to be many times ground zero for any drought impacts. And I really wanted to talk about the drought because when you think about drought, it's a topic that gradually impacts community over time. It's very different, and unlike the pandemic that occurred and that we are still in, that came about very rapidly and brought about changes to many communities. But nonetheless, a drought can be just as serious as a pandemic. But I think everyone would agree that this pandemic is really something that is unlike anything we've seen before. The pandemic has brought about immediate changes and immediate challenges for the state government and local governments, including tribal governments. It has really taken a toll on the resources that we have. And it also brings to light staffing to address these challenges. Make no mistake that the drought, to some degree, will also challenge state government, local governments, and tribal governments if it hasn't already. But some of these challenges of drought, they occur over a period of time, and you would think that you would have time to plan and mitigate those challenges when it comes to drought. But when it comes to this pandemic, the challenges were immediate. A lot of state governments, local governments, and tribal governments were reacting to what had occurred. And this brought to light a lot of topics that could be discussed when it comes to governance and reaction to impacts, whether it be drought or in this case, the pandemic. I think that we can all say that when you look back at what has occurred over the past year or so with the pandemic, that some things could have been done better and some things were done right. But I think I hope that we can all learn from what has occurred and make things, make the planning for any future events that much easier. I think that there were decisions made at the state level, at the local level, and the tribal level that everybody should take note of in their local governments, and to not let those things go uncorrected for future planning. And I think that as the legislative session for the state begins next week, I think it's something we all have to think about when our legislatures meet to discuss the state finances and the state laws, the planning. Is it just going to be business as usual? And I think a lot of people would think that it shouldn't be business as usual. We are in unprecedented times when it comes to politics, to a reaction to the pandemic, and locally the drought. And I think that the next couple of days to reflect upon these things and how we govern within our state and local communities. What is it that is priority, and where do we need to put resources into those priorities? I think that over the next couple of days, we can think about those types of issues, and we can only hope that we can continue to communicate with our local leadership to make sure that the decisions that are made today and tomorrow and the future are for the best interests of our communities. And that I'm proud to be part of the New Mexico Water Dialogue, to have a forum to speak about these water issues. And there is no one board member that is an expert on everything when it comes to water resources. There are a lot of educated and smart individuals who comprise the board, but they don't, not one of them knows everything about water resources. And that's why we have this dialogue, and we have representation from throughout the state that know their water resources in their area, and they provide input on things that are happening and important in their region. So I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us for the next couple of days, and be well and be safe. Thank you.
Jason, thank you so much. Your words always start us off on a really good foundation and a good sense of who we are. I really appreciate that. And as Jason said, the board is comprised of a lot of people with a lot of expertise in a lot of different areas, and together it really makes a beautiful whole picture, just as all these boxes on the screen are doing for me right now. So thank you all again for being part of this. I want to invite John D'Antonio to also offer us some welcoming remarks. John is speaking on behalf of our governor, who we had hoped might be able to attend, but needless to say, there are a lot of pressing issues for her. I know there are for you too, John, and I really appreciate you being able to be with us. John is our current state engineer, secretary of the Interstate Stream Commission, and has been in that position before, has been in the water world in New Mexico in many different capacities, and we're very honored to have you with us, John. Please.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lucy, and good morning, everybody. It's great to see the water community in New Mexico in these little boxes. It's amazing how many, how much interest is out there, and I think it's evident by the enrollment. I know we're up above 230 people now, which is really great for the water dialogue. My little talk today is entitled "Hotter, Drier, and Rising to the Occasion," which I think we all are interested in rising to the occasion and dealing with the challenges that we have before us. And I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to speak today. I want to welcome all of you to the Water Dialogue's 27th annual meeting. I'm honored to represent Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham and stand before all of you to launch our 50-year water planning effort. The governor regrets not being able to be here today, as the issues surrounding drought and water policy and planning are of utmost importance and concern to her. She is very busy preparing for a State of the State address, the upcoming legislative session, and of course the vaccine distribution, all the things that are happening in and around the Capitol. There's a lot of things. Spoke with her yesterday, and again, she sends her regrets for not being able to be here today. I'd like to thank Interstate Stream Director Rolf Schmidt-Peterson and our water planning program manager, Lucia Sanchez, for spearheading this water planning initiative. I also wish to recognize the large number of dedicated New Mexicans who work tirelessly on countless water resource issues our state faces. Ensuring our safe and plentiful supply requires ongoing assessment, planning, infrastructure, and vigilant protection of our water resources. Our past water planning efforts have helped bring us where we are today, but we need to be prepared for the changes that are coming. With climate change, the state needs to work harder than ever to help alleviate the additional stresses on communities, farmers, and ecosystems. I'm excited to be here today to announce the kickoff of the New Mexico's 50-year water planning initiative. An effective plan requires all New Mexicans to proactively work together to chart our water future. The governor has directed the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission to work with other state and federal agencies in the effort to develop a 50-year water plan. I'd like to acknowledge Lucia Sanchez from the Interstate Stream Commission and Nelia Dunbar from the Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources for taking the lead role in coordinating the planning effort. Ryan Gronwald and Lynette Geeson from the Army Corps of Engineers, Secretary Lynn Trujillo and Eldred Lisansi from the Department of Indian Affairs, and finally Myron Armijo from the State Engineer's Office, Daryl Vigil from the Jicarilla Apache Nation, and Aaron Chavez with the Water Dialogue are key players in our tribal Pueblo outreach and public outreach. The governor has 3 pillars for our planning initiative. She has communicated that to us ever since she started off the administration with her white paper and communicated to us what her priorities were. Those 3 pillars are stewardship, sustainability, and equity. For stewardship, we will harness the skills and knowledge of farmers and local communities, tribes and pueblos, our universities, governmental institutions, and more to improve the management of our water resources. While the pandemic put a hold on the ability to restore funding and staffing levels of key natural resource agencies, including the State Engineer's Office and Interstate Stream Commission, that were depleted during the previous administration, doing so remains a priority of Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham and is fundamental to stewardship of New Mexico's water resources. Again, we're dealing with some of those funding issues as we get into the legislative session. Good news is we're not taking a 5% cut this year based on state revenues, but we're still not where we need to be, and we're going to continue to work on getting those resources into our office. For sustainability, it's another pillar of this water plan. We have difficult choices to make to continue to grow and prosper in the face of smaller water supplies. We must balance the immediate needs for water with the long-term sustainability of the resource. We must strive to improve the resilience of our mountain watersheds to extreme fire and to keep our rivers whole, not only to meet local demands and our legal obligations for interstate compacts, but also to keep our watersheds, streams, and riparian areas healthy. For equity, we need to plan for a future where all New Mexicans have access to clean, safe water. The experts tell us that the impacts of continued warming are changing our climate and that the stresses on our water resources will become more severe. Our comprehensive 50-year water plan will examine the future water supply. By using best available science, we can develop estimates of the changes that are likely to occur and to use that information to plan and take actions to increase water resilience. The director of the Interstate Stream Commission, Rolf Schmidt-Peterson, is speaking tomorrow and will provide you more information on the details of the planning process, its schedule, and anticipated outcomes. You all, and I mean this really heartfelt, everyone that's attending this and others within the state of New Mexico, you all play a key role in this plan, as outreach for this effort will occur at many levels. And I just want to know and stress that we will be listening. It's just not a check the box. We really want that public outreach and input from everybody. The governor wants to stress that while we move forward on the 50-year water plan, we're also looking to do our part to reduce our carbon footprint. It's essential that we do everything we can to reduce the predicted impacts by taking action now to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The Climate Task Force that's led by Secretary Sarah Probst of the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, Natural Resource Department and Secretary James Kinney of the New Mexico Environment Department recently released the New Mexico Climate Strategy Report with recommendations for reducing our impact on climate. And we do have a lot of coordination with our natural resource agencies. We meet weekly. During the session, we meet 3 times a morning. We do coordinate efforts with the Environment Department, Energy, Minerals, Natural Resources, the Department of Game and Fish. We're all together in this, and we're going to make sure there's a concerted, coordinated effort with this administration. While the 50-year water plan will shed light on the severity of climate change impacts, progress is already underway to address many of our water resource management issues. Since Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham has taken office, we've invested over $16 million for 160 Essentia construction projects, $20 million to the construction of the Amut tribal water settlement and that water intake system, over $10 million for dam repairs, $1.5 million for surface and groundwater monitoring, and nearly $97 million for public water and wastewater systems. Under Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's watch, we have established the Water Data Act, the Forest and Watershed Act, and the Essentia and Community Ditch Infrastructure Fund. I'll end this portion by welcoming, and I do have a few more remarks. We're going to share a short video with you. I hope it's teed up to show. But I'll end this portion by saying that together we can work towards creating resilience in the use of water resources. But we need your engagement in this planning process. We value your thoughts and suggestions and welcome you to get involved in this process. And so I would ask that whoever's controlling the video, if they could engage that now, and then I'll have a few more comments after the video.
Thank you, John, so much. Thank you, Jeffrey, for queuing us up here.
I'm not hearing the audio. There's
No
audio.
sound, there's no audio.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Just bear with us, everybody. This is part of being online. We'll work it out.
Start it over here.
Hey, Jeffrey, this might be under video settings. You might have to optimize for sharing for the audio part. I run into this all the time teaching. Sorry.
I appreciate that. I have not encountered this before.
Oh, Eric, thank you.
Video settings. Okay.
And there's something in the chat.
Yeah, it's not in video settings. It's just when you share again, stop sharing, then
Okay.
reshare again. And when you share, select the box that says share audio.
Yep,
You got
there we go.
Missed that. Perfect. Thank you, guys.
See, the expertise that's out there is incredible.
Love
Great.
the teamwork. Take 3.
I feel like Mother Nature always gives us opportunities to learn. It's just how well we sort of accept the lesson.
The land, the water, the air, the animals, our customs and our traditions and our languages. If we want to have this resource saved for our children, our children's children, we have to do it in a way that's different.
We all know that we have challenges ahead of us related to climate change, but to kind of sit back and wait for the challenges to appear and then deal with them, I don't think is an approach that any of us want to be faced with.
A lot of the successes that we've had are because of the planning that we've done. That doesn't mean that we're done. It means there's more planning to do.
I think some of our best opportunities for improving the resiliency of our water systems focuses at headwater regions. The health of our intermittent streams is extremely important to how our main stem rivers function.
A lot of the people come from the city out here to enjoy the beautiful country that we have. We can't forget about our traditional uses of our land, planning how we're going to move forward and multiple uses of our public lands and forest.
The city can't stand alone in solving all of its water issues if we're not looking at our upstream and downstream challenges as well. It's going to be a creative solution, no matter what it is. It's not going to be an engineering solution. It's not going to be a social equity solution. It's got to be all those things.
Not everybody has the wherewithal, the capacity to provide just meeting the basic need. The lack of water to the household, but also the lack of providing adequate fire protection. It's a public health and safety issue. And something like the pandemic, people would have never thought that that could be such a huge piece and why water is so important.
The tribe's place in the state as the first inhabitants of this state, their contribution is going to be truly important to making any state water plan a success.
a big part of what's valuable isn't necessarily the ultimate document, but the discussions and shared understanding that's developed through the planning process. If we can invest in planning now and then implement the appropriate actions, it will save us a tremendous amount of money and resources in the long run.
The investments that we are going to have to make ensuring that our water plan is well funded, and how 50 years from now we can plan for that and do it in an effective way that's respectful of everybody that's involved, from the past to the present and to the future.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for getting that back on track for us. I thought a very, very good video. Shows all the diverse uses of water within the state of New Mexico, how important it is. It is truly our lifeblood. And I want to echo something that Jason John said to start the meeting. We're really dealing with two emergencies within the state of New Mexico, and it's really on top of the pandemic. We've had a really bad water year last year. We're on the throes of another extremely bad water year this year. We had active management of most every one of our rivers last year. The Upper Chama, the Rio Grande, Middle and Lower. You look at the Members Basin, and on the Pecos area, we're having to pump water into the Pecos right now to meet some of the requirements on our 2003 settlement agreement to make sure the senior water right holder, Carlsbad Irrigation District, gets water at the downstream end. They're the senior user. The Members Basin, San Francisco area. I mean, every corner of the state, we're struggling, and we will continue to struggle. One thing I want to stress is this water planning effort is not it's not going to be duplicative of previous and ongoing efforts. We want to expand beyond that and get to another level. Water budgets, modeling, they've been done in other venues. We'll be incorporating the best of the best information. But with it's a little bit, I guess, obvious. We have reduced supplies. I don't want to steal Rolf Schmidt-Peterson's thunder for his presentation tomorrow, but one of his slides was really noteworthy to me. Just looking at 19, and this is on the Rio Grande. There's a lot of concerns on the Rio Grande as we move forward. There's a lot of focus. If you look at the average annual flow in the Rio Grande from 1980 to 1999, it's over 1,250,000 acre feet per year. When you look at the next 20 years, from 2000 to 2020, it's down to 818,000 acre feet a year. So you've got about a 35% reduction in those stream flows. But then if you look at the long-term average, we're still really close to the 1 million acre feet a year that we've had over a period of time. I think one thing that we need to not lose sight of is that the Water Administration, compact compliance, they're intertwined. One of the things that is of note is that we're about 100,000 acre feet, or we will be, in debit status on the Rio Grande. We're not in violation until we get to twice that amount, 200,000 acre foot debit on the Rio Grande. One of the things I want to point out, and this is how involved and a lot of things that the nuances of managing water and understanding some of those issues. A little, I think, remembered fact is that there's been over 380,000 acre feet of credit relinquishment over the years. The first time I was state engineer, 2003, 2008, 2010, we relinquished credit water to the lower Rio Grande. That allowed us in Article 7 to store water in our post-1929 reservoirs, which allows us a lot of flexibility within the system to deal with Endangered Species Act issues in the middle Rio Grande, make sure we're not in violation of the, biological opinion. There's a whole lot of things that are really complex. We've got to keep in mind that there's, if it's not for this flexibility to store in those reservoirs, we'd be in a lot of trouble. It's a real balancing act. And we've got some tools at our discretion: active water resource management, our ability to actually do and put in district-specific regulations. We're going to be doing a lot of things with respect to management and it's about how we work together. It's solutions that are driven from stakeholders at the user level, and it's not a top-down driven solution. That never works. It's not going to work. And I appreciate the Water Dialogue for this forum. It's about talking, it's about communicating, and it's about being inclusive of all the needs within the state of New Mexico. I'm 1 minute over. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to pass this on, but really looking forward to this session in the next couple of days. And thank you, everybody, so much for your participation. We need everybody's involvement if we're going to be successful in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, John, so much. Thank you for your leadership. Thanks for taking the time to be here. And above all, thanks for your belief in inclusivity and hearing all voices. That's really music to the dialogue's ears. So really appreciate it. Thank you. So Virginia and I are going to do a quick agenda review, and Virginia's going to talk a bit about the technology here, which we've already experienced and gotten through a hurdle, which is great because there's always one, and it's already done. We've already done that. Then we're going to move on to our keynote speaker, Eric. Eric, have no fear. You will have a full 30 minutes no matter when you start. Okay, so, and that means if people are looking at the agenda, after Eric, we have a break at which it will be more or less at 10 o'clock, but it will be when Eric is done. So it may be, you may lose 5 or even 10 minutes out of your break, which is scheduled for half an hour. So I think that will be okay. Following the break, we have a panel with Laura Pascas and some great panelists, and that will then be it for today. We will adjourn at noon. Tomorrow, we'll see you again, all at 9 o'clock, and we will really dive into the 50-year water plan that John has kind of prepped for us. Rolf Schmidt-Peterson has a presentation put together. We will have another panel, and then in the afternoon, you break into breakout groups. We're calling them table talks. You all signed up for different tables. That is going to be a massive technological undertaking. We've got 17 tables. We've got 220 people to put into those tables. Virginia is going to be like a wizard tomorrow and make all that happen. So it'll be exciting. I see it as a very big adventure we're embarked on here. And following that, the breakouts will have report outs from all of the tables, quick, snappy report outs. And then we'll have a wrap up in which we will ask you for ideas about nominations for the board of the dialogue. By then, you'll have a pretty good feel for what the dialogue is all about. We're always looking for new board members that bring something new to the group in terms of geography, ethnicity, interest, expertise, whatever. So we'll deal with that a little bit later. Virginie, do you want to talk about recording, chat, etc.?
Yes, thanks, Lucy. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see so many faces on this morning's call. And if you're new to the Water Dialogue, welcome. We're so happy that you joined us this morning and again tomorrow. I will make my comments very brief because we've got a packed agenda, as Lucy just reviewed. I just wanted to point out a couple things about this, the Zoom platform. It looks like all of you are handling your microphones. Just a reminder to keep yourselves muted, to keep the background noise down unless you're speaking, obviously. And then, of course, the flip side is remember to unmute yourselves in the event that you are a presenter or speaking. If you're able to and willing to, we encourage you to keep your cameras on. It's really nice in these times of virtual conferences to see each other's faces. It makes for a much more fun and meaningful meeting. And we understand if you're unable to, that's totally fine. Just an encouragement. The chat box, thank you for introducing yourselves and saying hello in the chat box. As presenters give their presentations, please feel free to post your questions throughout the day, and we will do our best here behind the scenes to manage the chat box and keep track of questions.
If we miss your question for whatever reason, you can put it back in the chat box, or you can raise your hand, or raise your hand using the reaction at the bottom of your screen. There's an icon that says reaction. You can raise your hand there. And speaking of, there's a couple ways to view. If you will see at the top right corner of your screen, a little icon that says view. You can go back and forth between speaker view and gallery view. I think it's fun to be in gallery view sometimes because you can see all the faces. And if you'd like to make it bigger just to see the speaker's face, you can do that as well. Let me check my notes to make sure I don't have anything else. I think that's it. Thanks again for joining us. If you're experiencing any tech issues, feel free to private message me. You can do that in the chat box. Other than that, I think we're all set to go. Back to you, Lucy, I think.
Great. Thank you, Virginie. If anybody does have any technical questions, put them in the chat and we'll try to address them either privately to you or to the whole group if it's something we need to talk about. So I would like to turn to Eric. And Eric is going to be our keynote speaker. Really honored to have you here, Eric. Eric's a professor of environmental science and Southwest studies at Colorado College. He's a geographer and political ecologist, which is like, I love that thought, political ecologist. That's a lot to think about there. He's the author of Political Ecologies of Cattle Ranching in Northern Mexico, Private Revolutions. That was in 2010. And he will speak on unsettled waters in an unsettling climate, learning from New Mexico. So although you're in Colorado, it's nice you're looking across the border, and wonderful that you've joined us. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Lucy. And first, I want to thank the board for inviting me. What you have in front of you, and thanks, Jeff, for setting us up already. I am not in control of the slides this morning, folks, so I'm just going to have to give like subtle finger gestures when I'm ready to advance the slide. Thanks for rolling with me, Jeff. What I really want to convey here is two things, is that this is, I think of this as a compendium of your knowledge of New Mexican stories about water adjudication, what it does, what it doesn't do. And in terms of some of the aspects that I had no clue about. You know, when I first moved out here in 2005, back out west, I was thrilled to be back out west, but I really thought, quite honestly, that all I was going to do was write a little puff piece on acequias and climate change, send that to High Country News, and that would be it, right? It was going to be a short story. And then I asked the right question, which I thought at the time was the wrong question, because they kept talking, you know, as I walked along ditches with folks on acequias. I was like, what is this A word you keep mentioning, this adjudication word? And and that sent me down the rabbit hole to try to understand this. And there are very few people who have paid attention to adjudication as an actual issue or a challenge or a problem. So unless it's your job, such as this data engineer, John D'Antonio, who was one of my first state level interviews 10 years ago, that seems like an eternity ago. Unless it's your job to do it, or you're affected by it in one of these stream adjudications, and the state has effectively sued you to prove, you know, what kind of water rights you have, and they make you an offer, and then you can test that. Very few people write about this. Very few people know about water adjudication as a process. What is learned, what is settled, that's a bad pun, what is actually adjudicated in the process. And I came to be fascinated by it, not as a legal scholar. That's my big disclaimer. I am not a JD, but sort of taking a critical lens to this to say, how does water go from, Jeff, can we advance this? How does water become not just a spiritual thing? How is it not just a community gift that is shared amongst villagers because you need it to survive? How does it become property? How does it become a use right property? And then how does it become a commodity? And we already have water trading occurring across the West. We already have water rights being bought and sold left and right, translations and ratios between groundwater and surface water. Now, this is not to diminish that as a tool. It is to say that it's very complex, that people are doing the best they can in trying to make that work. But it is both a social science fiction, right, that water is a property, and it's a natural science fiction that waters can be co-equivalent, right? Between shutting down one groundwater well to say, well, I'll use the surface water rights here, I'll trade you for those groundwater rights. So I became fascinated with this. And as a geographer, obsessed with place and space and kind of scales of water, it became a story I couldn't let go. And it took me a long while to try to figure out how to write this into a book because it's not just a single story. But what was revealed is that it illuminates a lot of different things. Jeff, can we get to the next slide? So what I'm saying here shouldn't be shocking. I'm going to try to do this efficiently here so that I don't run out of time or belabor the points. But these are just some of the quotes that come from some of the 274 people I spoke with about adjudication. And it gives you a kind of a flavor of how people think about it. Why it is that the state of New Mexico in 1907 with the water code essentially, I hate to put it this way, blackmailed itself into doing this because it says the state engineer shall adjudicate all surface waters, right? You know, that's a tough and that's a tough sell and a tough job. And all you have to do is read those first reports of the first territorial engineer to realize what an impossible task that was. The guy didn't even have a desk available. He had no assistants. He had to go to the feds at the time to try to get the tools to try to measure water at a surface level. And that's even before we get to groundwater. So I came to appreciate the complexity of the task at hand, how the state has demanded this of itself. And in a state, let's be honest, that is not exactly resource rich in any way, shape, or form, right? New Mexico has long been a pretty poor state and was largely agrarian until, you know, World War II and after. So I think the challenges there, you know, came to me as a sort of, aha, this is not a simple task and why do we keep doing it? So if we could get to the next slide, that'd be great, Jeff. And this was one thing that even my own colleagues asked me, like, why are you obsessing about New Mexico instead of Colorado? Well, there's a couple of key things about New Mexico. You have at least 3 overlapping, I don't really call them legal traditions, but sort of sovereignty. The sovereign, who's we knock says point is right, all own water of water or it can be a resource owned by someone, the actual water. Important states to learn from. So it's a little strange for me to be talking to New Mexicans about your own stuff and your own water, but here we are. I think it offers a lot of lessons to other states. And I think if we think about where prior appropriation governs across the Western US here on this slide, everything that's in white, this is not some kind of racial joke here, really runs on some kind of template cookie cutter version of the prior appropriation code, right? First in time, first in right. The oddities here, well, Texas should be striped out with something completely different because Texas is just, let's be honest, it's strange for water law in all sorts of ways. And I feel safe saying that here in a New Mexico water dialogue. I'm not sure I could do that in Texas water dialogue. If you look at the other hash patterns there for Kansas, Oklahoma, California, that means they're using some kind of hybrid system, right? That recognizes both riparian, right? Active stream flow use that is not a first in time, first in right, and prior appropriation. And things are even perhaps more dire, more complicated sometimes for California because they have not just a complicated water shortage situation there where they've doled out 4 to 5 times as many water rights as they have water available in the state. But no, it's worse than that. They have riparian and prior appropriation, and they're having to reconcile finally with that last huge drought. And they finally enacted in 2014 that groundwater is part of surface water. Imagine that all water is connected, and it always has been. So, you know, this is to also say that there's a lot for other states to learn from New Mexico in terms of paying attention to these things. Chillingly, even though, you know, lots of New Mexicans like to make new jokes about how how do I put this? Adjudication is eternal and will be with us forever. I'm not sure that's the case, but California actually, thought that they might actually try to adjudicate their own waters. And that's how bad it was back in 2014. It's like, oh, maybe we could pursue water rights adjudications and that would solve everything. All that would do is really count some version of what we think water exists in the state. And to be fair to the process too, I think, what you have here is a map of the current adjudications, pending ones. The ones that are completed are in the solid gray. Sorry if that scale of the screen, if you're looking on a small device, doesn't convey. But you can see where these are complete, and they're largely on the small, kind of minor watersheds that were first prioritized in some ways because there was a little priority given, and no one really talks about this much, to the sort of small agrarian kind of purposes, right, for water rights adjudications. They were actually doing that up front as a way to prioritize senior water rights users as farmers, as irrigators, even as the economy sort of wholesale shifted during the 20th century. What you see in all the hashing there are just the pending. And then anything that's blank on that New Mexico map is to be determined. So this is, the scale and the enterprise, right, involved with this is daunting, right? And that's one thing that has always impressed me is like, how is this possible? And spending billions of dollars to count really what amounts to not a lot of water when you look at it in terms of the waters that flow through New Mexico. So it's a kind of an exercise, a legal exercise in scarcity, but you learn a lot through this process. Jeff, could we get to the next slide? So again, I'm going to do this really quickly, Jeff, so bear with me. How do we go from water is vital, sacred, next slide, to one where it's a shared institution, right, under acequias, where people have to take what is available water and then apportion it and share it out, right, until about the 1907 Water Code, where suddenly, magically, overnight, supposedly, legally, water is a property right as an access right, right? Those three stages are pretty significant. Now, the 20th century, in terms of those infrastructure projects that trigger adjudication, that's really where this starts. And on the right-hand side of your screen here, you see a little illustration that comes straight out of the book. It's a sort of cartographic rendition there of the San Juan Chama project, which to me, is the major 20th century, late 20th century trigger point for the Office of State Engineer being like, okay, now it gets serious because we're transferring water from the Colorado River, right? New Mexico's share of 13% of the Colorado River into New Mexico, largely for drinking water projects. So a big part of that goes to Albuquerque, a big part of that goes to Santa Fe. That's why the Buckman Diversion Project is built in Santa Fe, spending hundreds of millions for 5,000 acre feet of water. That's what triggers it, because you're mixing the waters. And so having to count those water and account for them as it moves into New Mexico. And obviously, that's really what triggers the adjudication for any stream if you're on the Chama, is that the Chama is no longer just the Chama, right? It's actually some San Juan water, which could have been Colorado water, which is now state of New Mexico water, and then mixes into Rio Grande water. And so having to be like a water accountant, I'm not sure I'd want to be one of those project operators, because you're kind of dealing in Bitcoin for water in terms of values that are mixed waters, but you have to at least account for what percentage is coming from what part of the system. So that's really, to me, the trigger point in terms of sparking a lot of these northern New Mexican adjudications. That's why I paid attention, if we can go to the next one, on those two big adjudications that became settlements because of the complexities involved. And again, I make no bones about this. This is all because of sovereignty, right? Sure, the McCarran Act of 1952 gave states the authority to adjudicate waters and to bring other native sovereign nations into these acts, even if native sovereign nations were a little resistant to this because they fall under federal law, not state law. So the fact that they become settlements is no accident, but you're talking about court cases that took nearly 5 decades before they were settled. And so, I didn't pick that title of the book, Unsettled Waters, by mistake. This is about settler colonialism. It is about settlement in terms of water. And in some ways, New Mexico is a state where people didn't homestead so much as waterstead. You needed to find irrigation water to survive and to make a living. So in these, the tales and complexities that people shared, and their stories of adjudication, and then their stories of settlement are sometimes deeply benign, and stories of like, yeah, it worked fine. I got the water that I deserved and that I had as a permit, as a title. In other cases, they are deeply painful because it also exacerbates relationships on the ground when you have to prove to others or prove to the courts what water rights you actually own or have access to for use rights. And in those cases, there were some real problems with those two cases, right? As part of these settlement acts, and I'm happy to get into this because this is one of the, I'm not sure how to talk about this, but again, a sort of a natural science fiction about connectivity of waters and some of the deals that have to make these settlements work, right? Is that we think of science as sort of this vast, ambitious, complex network, but I think law is even more demanding. I think it has to cover and explain a lot more than science, which is always done in small gains. So as part of that settlement act, if we could go back one, sorry, Jeff, the Amit and the Abeda adjudications, right? So the Pohoaki Valley, largely dry in the Taos Valley, become conjoined twins because of, next slide, the water that has to be transferred from top of the world farms as part of the deal to allocate water to the Amit settlement, which to me is one of those fascinating transfers, right? And that binds in some ways these cases together. Of course, Taos was not very happy as a county to have to, quote unquote, send water downstream the Rio Grande to satisfy the Pohoaki Valley's water demands. So what I love about these stories is that they bind New Mexico together through water, through cases, and also in terms of the real challenges that New Mexico faces, right? To settle legal acts because of water that may or may not exist in time and space nearby. But this is the case throughout the West. So this is not to pick on New Mexico, right? Or these transfers. It is to say, this is emblematic of what the West will face in terms of transferring these water rights that are retired from groundwater and top of the world farms here that existed, sort of in northern Taos County, and that was then retired as a surface water right downstream to finally settle out the water deal in what happened to be the Amit settlement case. So to me, these are fascinating stories that bind these tales together and bind New Mexicans in ways that I don't think even New Mexicans would have imagined 50 years ago, or that even Steve Reynolds, as a former state engineer, could have imagined. So I think that's one of the really complex stories that you have in New Mexico. Can we get to the next slide, Jeff? So the second part of the book, I know this is impossible to do, I'm trying not to resort to auctioneer speed here, is how this water expertise actually, paralleled adjudication as an experience. How do you produce adjudicators? How are legal scholars trained to count water? How do you actually count for these like 0.5 acre feet of water, and why spend, more than $100 in a court case trying to settle that? So, again, part of this is the process, not just technology as technology, but law is a form of technology. It is a tool. It had to be developed. And along with that was engineering. So I came to understand that dams as part of the hardware and law as the software for adjudication were critical, and that expertise had to be kind of developed in time, in real time, and exercised in a way that was simultaneous to this. That again, the 1907 Water Code, or the first territorial engineer, couldn't have imagined what the state would look like later on, even if reservoirs were part of that mix. Can we go to the next slide? So instead of water looking like the top left diagram with people working on an acequia ditch, trying to line the ditch for efficiency and trying to get water downstream, you get to a relationship with water where we start to measure it in new forms, right? Because of the conversion. So it's not just a legal conversion, it's a quantitative, it's a metric conversion. So instead of talking about surcos of water, right, in Spanish, which, you know, if you're a Mayor Domo, sort of looked like this much water. And I'm doing the hand gesture on purpose there, because they knew how much water it would take to cover a surface. You get to a relationship with water where it's measured by that. You see that hydraulic box there on the little water gauge, lower left. I'll just say somewhere outside Las Vegas, New Mexico, cryptically, and that's someone whose faces cannot be seen on purpose, to a relationship with water where the river looks like a network diagram, right, as an operator. So you think about that changing relationship to water. It's not just that we've changed the hydrological relationship, as Sandra Postel might argue in her book Replenish, and I know she's out there. She's right here in the group. Kudos to you, Sandra. It's also our changing relationship to water and the other water users on the river. And I think that's the other part of the story that I was fascinated with, is that we've had to treat and envision water in a completely abstract and different way than what it used to be, which was working directly with water. Next slide, please. And yeah, that's not really interesting. That's an adjudication going to water settlement as legal representatives wrangled with the quantitative amounts in the settlement language back in 2010, when we were one of like 3 or 4 people in some stuffy roundhouse room as legal attorneys were wrangling over the settlement language and try to reconcile between the settlement acts. Can we go to the next slide? But to me, this aspect of, you know, how these adjudications become settlements is really fascinating. And it's long been the favored course, like since the Reagan era, right? To try to take it out of the courts, to stop fighting about it and try to figure out, okay, what would everyone be satisfied with? What can we actually provide? And I think one of the tough things is that some of those settlements agree to things that don't exist locally, right? Like if there's not enough water to satisfy the demands of each party, they have to look for it elsewhere. And I think that's really a demand in law as part of settlement that really few people talk about. So settlement may just be as expensive and as big a hassle as adjudication. That's the spoiler. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then this last part is really thinking about the future of your water itself. You know, Mr. D'Antonio reflected on some of these figures about the percentage losses that may be in effect now, and I try to talk about this in the book a little bit in terms of what water share, percentage-wise, climate change will claim. Like, drought does not care about our feelings. Climate change does not care about our feelings, and it certainly does not care about our legal system. So we think about climate change, but we don't think about policy or legal changes, right? And I think in some ways, this century is going to demand of us a kind of bravery to not treat water codes, state constitutions, statutes as scripture, but hey, these can be changed or amended as reality demands. And I think, to me, that's one of the big takeaways, that if, you know, physical water has changed and that there's no such thing as stationarity, as some scholars put over a decade ago, we actually have to accept too that legal stationarity is dangerous if we don't change these policy dimensions to water law. And I hope that that's not a controversial statement, but I think it does reflect the sort of shared scales of Western water, whether you're talking about the ditch level, top left, and you're managing on acequia. If you're the state engineer, the box of New Mexico in that lower left is really your purview and your concern, right? How do you balance between those drainages? Finally, to thinking about the connectivity between huge watersheds. So much of drinking water now depends on the allocation coming down the Chama. Not to mention Endangered Species Act, or how much water Bosque del Apache gets. These are really problems to think about. Let me go to the next one. And I think part of this is also reconciling, you know, at a larger spatial scale, what will drought do? How will this be addressed? And I'm not saying this, you know, from a distance where we, you know, we're innocent. If you look at where the crisis dots here on conflict potential highly likely, this map is 15 years old. That's Albuquerque down to Las Cruces, but hey, I'm up near the Front Range, right? So this notion of, you know, drought is a shared concern. And in these megapolitan regions where we're transferring water, where drought is frequent, this is a shared concern across all Western states. And that, to me, I think is the biggest lesson from New Mexico, is that if New Mexico can do this and detail out what part of consumptive water matches what spatial scale of water in the state. What will that teach other states? And conversely, is it worth it in terms of the financial burden for the state to keep doing it in the same way? Or will the state engineer be able to go to like a bulk permit kind of thing that says, okay, these huge demands here quantified, you've got those water rights, signed, sealed, delivered. So I think some of this is really thinking through what kind of alternate tools could be used. Can we go to the next slide? And finally, instead of thinking about total sum raw allocations, right? Like we know there's not 18 million acre feet in the Colorado River. And there's even a 10th as much, a 20th as much in the Rio Grande every year. Instead of thinking about water rights as some absolute top quantitative measure, thinking about proportional sharing, which to me, like actually using the water that actually exists in time and space year to year might be a better way, right? Thinking about percentages, not just net allocations. And that to me is something that I came back to the ditch for in thinking through in really grounded terms what we have to learn from these prior communities, these prior experiences, and these prior sovereigns who continue to occupy the same spaces as they always have. And I think part of this is really recognizing that expertise occurs at all scales. We have a lot to learn. I went into that project trying to listen as much as possible to every form of expertise. And my only regret is that Juan Esteban Arellano, among many others, who have died since that big field period of 2010, are no longer around to share that wisdom. But I thank you for your time. I'm happy to take pot shots, questions, insults, or injuries to my person. And I really appreciate your time, and I'm just honored by being able to be here. And I'll just give one last little prop to Chuck Forsman for allowing me to use his painting cover art. He's at CU Boulder, and if that looks familiar, that is actually, you guessed it, Cochiti Dam, one of the biggest earthen dams on the planet. And he painted it from the perspective near the outlet pipes, if you've been down there near Cochiti Dam. And I thought, there's the cover. And I ran across it in our own Fine Arts Center here as a painting here in Colorado Springs. I thought, that's it. That's what I need. That's the critique that I'm trying to address here. How do we address these overlapping uses of water and the critiques of them? So thanks again. Appreciate it.
Eric, thank you so much. I can't imagine a more appropriate keynote for us. Really, really well done. We have some questions. We're going to adjourn at 10:10 for the break, but let's get in as many questions as we can here. And also there was a request for a copy of your slides. Is that possible, Eric, to make them available to everybody attending here?
Yes, I've made sure that no one's face in particular, other than Juan Esteban Arellano, who's already sadly passed, is recognizable. So there's no issues there in terms of permissions or anything. Thanks.
Excellent, excellent. We'll make sure that that happens. Thank you again. So let me just read the first question here from Wade. Do you have any thoughts on acre foot right versus diversion/flow right in terms of adjudication? What is the common ground or method to equalize?
Wow. Let me think if I understand this correctly. So I think part of this is what I was trying to get at is, all water rights systems, regardless of where you are in the world, need a metric. You need to measure it with something. In the past, it wasn't that big of a deal if you're talking about 50 villagers with 30 acres and you're sharing volume with whatever water is available. And so those notions of measures, whether it was based on in some parts of the world, I'd call the tarea or the vara stick, right? Or you would call the surco as the volume of water for a field, right? So I think in terms of the current acre foot measure, right, versus diversion, I worry less about that. I mean, the one thing I couldn't do in a kind of harried, like 20-minute rendition of a usually 40-minute talk that's part of a book that you can't do even in 40 minutes is the fact that you need those metrics. All of them are a kind of scientific fiction that any society chooses to say, okay, that's our measure. I think what's kept the system afloat is not any particular metric, but the fact that, how do I put this? That because agriculture declined, right, as the primary way of making a living, and agriculture uses most of the water in any Western state, that relaxation of it actually kept the system afloat for much of the 20th and 21st century. So even if a century ago, and this was long suspected even as they were writing the water code for New Mexico, there was really concern that the water was already fully allocated, right? Even at the time. I would say that decline in agriculture as the major livelihood for most New Mexicans is actually what kept the system going, because as you get retirements of agricultural land, that frees up huge amounts of water going downstream. So I think this notion of, versus acre foot or diversion flow, I think to me it's more about the proportion, right? And sort of in any year-to-year plan, as the state engineer D'Antonio can tell you, you have to work with what you have, but you also have to work with what the constraints are for any legal compact, what's coming down the gates, from the San Luis Valley, what exits, and how much are Texans suing you on the lower Rio Grande to get access to, 7% capacity in Elephant Butte Dam now these days? Ridiculous. So I think the constraints there are not just climate change. New Mexico is pinched between headwaters, the vast majority of water coming down the Rio Grande, coming out of Colorado, and the demands of Texas as sort of the water beast that knows no end or hunger to its water lust. Frankly, that's how I view it now. I sort of view it as a New Mexican. It's very strange for me to say that, but so I think that's really the proportional sharing part is the bit that I'm kind of most intrigued by. Can that be codified in a way where the new compacts of this century that are going to have to be tweaked, frankly, will they recognize that or not? Like, are we going to recognize, I think as someone put in the comments here, the laws of physics or not? Because you can't get away from entropy and you can't get away from thermodynamics. And if matter cannot be created or destroyed, well, then you're left with the water you have, not the water you want to have or you imagine, right? Like, we can tell each other short stories, but those are short stories. And I think, in order to kind of wake up from this kind of shared reality, in some ways, the cli-fi and water fictions are great ways to kind of tell each other horror stories, to be like, oh, wow, it could get that bad. So maybe we should, plan backwards from that, try to avoid the worst. If no one's read The Water Knife by Paolo Bacigalupi, highly recommended. A little bit of Mad Max with some water. Good story.
Great. Thank you, Eric. I urge everybody to look at Paula Garcia's comment. Thank you, Paula. Paula is the director of the New Mexico Essentia Association, and points out at the end of her comment there that the relational way of managing water will be increasingly important as climate change intensifies, and that we should look at a both and in terms of the kind of sacred old way of doing it and the technical legal way of doing it. And let me just go to Trevor's question of curiosity. Bitcoin for water, he heard you say. Have you heard any studies applying the blockchain to water rights?
Thankfully, no. But yeah, this is how I get in trouble, even in the classroom up here at Colorado College. I'll say these, dropped comments a little too loosely to the side. But I think the point there is to think about when you look, and the New York Times had a really good piece about Western water and sort of water futures and where investment is occurring, and to think about, derivatives that got us into trouble the first time in the first economic collapse. Remember that, folks? 2007, 2008. I know it seems like 500 years ago now. I think, there's a huge hunger for new kind of markets. And I didn't, go into this book, even though I look the part with my beard now, as some radical Marxist trying to, decry the fall of capitalism and what comes next. And but I think we really have to take seriously, like, what are we going to allow as a kind of water futures market that actually can deprive other people of their future if we're not careful? Because you can get some seriously shady deals on water trading, water investments that don't abide, again, by an actual physical water market, right? If you're just talking about futures and options, there's a danger to that I'm afraid will get people into, well, at least financial trouble, if not hydrological trouble. But there was a great recent Times piece about that, and I hope people caught that, because it's not just coming, it's already here, and people are trading water. Quite apart from sort of state allocations of trading water rights, or allowing transfers, that's sort of been happening for decades now. But we're talking about active water trading. But I'm not aware of a blockchain mechanism yet for adjudication or simplifying that, if that's more direct.
Great, thank you, Eric. I promised we would go on break at 10:10. It's now 10:11. I'm really torn because we have a lot more good questions. And I see a lot of really attentive faces that want to hear more from you. So I think I will officially call a break. Anybody is absolutely free to go do what they need to do. And I will see you back at 10:30. Eric, if you can hang around and scroll through the chat, look at all your fans, and take your kudos. And if you want to keep talking during the break, why not? And anyone who wants to spend their break listening to Eric talk some more, do so. So absolutely free to go. Please come back at 10:30. Yeah,
Lucy, just a quick word.
Yeah.
I don't know if Eric can see this, or if you can see this, but there's a question from a caller who can't put the question in the chat.
Great. Virginia, let's take that. Let me call the break right now. Free to go. See you back at 10:30. And now let's take the call from the question from the caller.
Excellent. So I don't see a name. I'm going to ask them to unmute. The number is 505-290-7120 if you'd like to ask your question.
This is where I feel like an operator.
Yeah.
Caller, are you there?
Can you,
Well,
Virginia, can you see what's happening? Can you see?
No, they disappeared from the screen. So I say let's carry on, and maybe they'll raise their hands again.
Great. So Eric, why don't you just scroll down there?
All right, let's see. So many questions, so many good ones.
We covered Wade, we covered Paula Garcia and Steve Harris and Trevor. Patrick McCarthy is kind of next in line. But go wherever feels to you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the proportional sharing thing, I think, is actually starting to happen, but under different guises. I think, the official term is something like alternative water management plan, as opposed to calling it just acequia logic, which I think would be more honest in terms of proportional sharing. But hey, who am I as a Coloradan to use that kind of language against New Mexicans? I think, this notion of proportional sharing is pretty smart. I mean, you're just basically tallying, thinking about the actual snowpack in any given year, and then figuring out what's your irrigation season. And I would say, the elders that I met on, dozens, maybe 100 ditches over the last 10 years, used to tell these stories about, 70 and 80-year-olds, typically men, who would go up, measure the snowpack, figure out how much there was, and they'd be like, well, that looks like about May 15th to August 15th. Because they would sort of have figured out at that point what quantity of water that would translate to for any given year. And, given how technified and quantitative our metrics are now, that should not be an impossible task. I think what constrains proportional sharing in any single given state is that it's not really state water, right? Like, we pretend it's state water rights as soon as they enter New Mexico, but then they leave your purview as soon as they enter El Paso. So I think the compacts, play a real critical role, these agreements and proportional sharing, to figure out how those will be reflected. Because it's easy to do it at a dish level, but try to scale that up, and that becomes a little more complex. And I think that's really what's involved here to make that manageable. I see a question for, Bob Wesley. Wow, that's a good one. Changing regulation statutes versus Fifth Amendment cannot take property rights. Well, here we are. They were called amendments, I think, for a reason, is because they got amended in the first place. So I'm not threatening the Fifth Amendment here on like takings or anything, but I think understanding that water rights uses as property rights have always been contingent, right? Like you can't use your full water rights if there's no water, right? You may have access to 10 acre feet legally, but if there's only 6 acre feet in the stream, well, guess what? Even if you're the senior water rights user, you're only getting 6 acre feet. So I think some of this is really reconciling with just some basic common sense, a system that really does not reflect reality, right? Like the maximum water use acre feet is great if you're in a flood. And that's how it even worked, 100, 200, 300 years ago. No one worried about that. Once you start thinking about scarcity, you might need to consider a better system without, forgive the French here, pissing off your neighbors by taking all the water in the river, even if you have rights to it. And I think avoiding fights is what most good neighbors do. I think once you get into really scarce environments, or people thinking that their property is absolute and not contingent to other people's rights, that's where we have trouble in allowing others to have use rights to that. That's a real problem. Let's see, Rick Schrader, geographer, how would you project?
Eric, let me just interrupt a moment. I'm going to stop you at 10:25.
Great.
So that the people that are sticking with you can run and do what they need to do and be back by 10:30.
I think that's smart.
Okay? So I'm going to give you this sound. You like that? Yeah, I'll give you that sound when you've got 1 minute left.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead.
It's like a 70s game show. I love it.
Yeah, right.
Like the Bell Show, the Gong Show. As a geographer, how would you project rural areas will evolve in cultural, economic, geography patterns, given hydrogeology connection locally, and yet some of that water needing to flow to other areas as per software agreements? Boy, that's too big a question for me. I'm not sure my salary is that high, but
yeah, it's too broad. Focus it on what you want to.
Oh, okay. No, I think it's a great question. I think the problem here is recognizing that most of the senior water rights are held in rural areas. But would you think that would be like a natural advantage, just like under prior appropriation, right? Like the older the water right, the more secure your water right should be. But there's a perverse kind of relationship there too, is that if that's true and you have, let's say, 50 acre feet of water rights and your water right is 1703 or something like that, that also means you're targeted for those water rights. Like people will come out and say, hey, are you interested in selling your water rights? It's hugely valuable. So to think that you're in a good place for senior water rights, that also makes you an attractive target for water profiteers, water marketers, brokers who are trying to wheel and deal for other agencies. And frankly, other cities that are trying to scrape by with very little in terms of a water portfolio. So I think that balance between city country is an ongoing one, but New Mexico does it in a pretty good way compared to some other states. Here in Colorado, we've had this tragedy of buy and dry, which is our, slang colloquial Coloradan term for like, we're buying out your rural water rights. And if you want a really sad place to go look, Crowley County, along the Arkansas River Valley, they basically, like 80% of the folks there sold their water rights to Aurora and Denver. And it just like desolated the entire valley. There may be, a few dozen families left who farm there. But that is the choice, right? And even in our own, I'll pick on Colorado because that's pretty safe. We came up with this Colorado water plan 5 years ago that is not really a plan so much as a grand wish list of aspirational goals. It actually makes for hilarious reading if you read it. Like, as New Mexicans, you'll really enjoy the fact, because Colorado is supposed to be fully adjudicated and like, we know what we're doing. But when you read this sort of aspirational wish list of what the Colorado water plan will include, there's no getting around. And they made it even more poignant and tragic by calling like subtle short-term leases from agricultural to cities ATMs, literally alternative transfer mechanisms. Well, I get cash from an ATM. And so they're literally labeling these rural districts as like, oh, would you like to engage in an ATM? Which immediately, if I was a farmer, I'd be like, get off my property before I shoot you, because it basically treats them like a cash account for water rights. Like that to me, I was like, whoever came up with that moniker really needs to rethink their goals and aspirations as a career, because you better be like a Bernie Madoff or a finance person to get away with that kind of language in any kind of boardroom. So I think that tension between city country is going to haunt us for decades, and we have to find a way to, I think, also do the right thing in city settings to say, like, this is also a land use and zoning issue. Like, any new construction should have water collection built on the roof now. And frankly, 30 years ago, because we have parked our butts in sort of lazy mode, I would say, since the 70s on any water conservation. And that should be built into any kind of building code right now, and not just Santa Fe, not just the places like Boulder, right, the People's Republics of, that are, kind of left and willing to do this. But that's true conservative behavior. It's conservation, right? It's using what you have and holding on to it and using it wisely. So this is not a political thing. This is just a physics. It's a water resource thing. Like, how do we use water in one place locally so it doesn't affect others? Yeah, I don't know if that gets at it.
Thank you, Eric. I'm going to skip us down to, can you share any good examples in US or global where a private water rights system, such as prior appropriation, was replaced with a proportional allocation system?
Okay, this is great, because you know what? It's in New Mexico. So all these things, that are alternative management plans, right? For thinking about ditch use, right? Exactly. State Engineer D'Antonio just came in with thumbs up, right? These things already exist, and they're just getting recognized as kind of proportional arrangements between several watersheds. Yeah, someone just exactly said the shortage sharing agreements, right? Which really is just a Saki logic, right? Is like, you use the water that's available. You don't just count on water that isn't there and say, like, that's my water. That's kind of Lawrence of Arabia kind of craziness, right? That's Omar Sharif coming up on his camel saying that is not your water, that is my water, So I think these notion of proportional sharing is already happening throughout New Mexico. Even in Colorado, it just takes a different name, right? But it's largely a shortage sharing agreement. Or they do complex things like, you'll never have heard about this, New Mexico. Well, you get the water Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we get it Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Yeah, guess what that is? That's the same logic. Community ditch sharing, a Saki logic, same thing. So I think this is being figured out the world over, and in places where they're going to have to not just do the shortage sharing thing, but think of water in different ways. So if water is going to fall differently, does the future of reservoirs include groundwater storage, not just open reservoir? We're not talking about dams, right, that stop a river, but dams that parallel a river, right, like Buckman, and let it fall in, it doesn't disrupt the entire ecology. And I think, the notion of thinking about underground water storage, if I could get behind any kind of infrastructure, right, that isn't just beaver dams and natural river flows and logs, it would be a kind of underground water storage at key points along the Rio Grande where you could draw on that, and where you have, seasonal flooding, and to think about storage in a way that that better reflects, what we're going to face, which is less snowpack, more rain, more drought, and yet more flooding, right? Like, we know about the sort of the paleoecology of Western rivers. Even when you're in a mega drought, doesn't mean it can't flood. So I think storage is really going to be a very different kind of translated image in the future.
Eric, thank you so much. I'm going to take the last few seconds to just try to figure out how we can get you connected to the rest of the questions here. I know anybody can copy the chat by like blocking it and saving it to your own, Word document or whatever. But I just hate to have these really fabulous questions go unanswered, but we need to give people like a couple of minutes to go do what they need to do and come back at 10:30. So Eric, I'm going to leave that to you to copy your questions there and see what you can do about that. Is that okay?
I have provided also, I just typed in the chat box my email address, and anyone under the sun is able to email me there. I promise I'll respond within a day or two. I'm usually an email addict, and I'm here at Email Addicts Anonymous. My name is Eric. I've been a member for at least 30 years of Email Addicts Anonymous.
Great, great.
I'll answer any question. So
thank you. That's very generous of you. Thank you, Eric, so much.
No, thank you.
We'll see everybody in just 4 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's an honor.
Okay, folks, it is 10:30. Jeffrey, thank you for running our scrolling screen shot, whatever you call it. I hope people take some time and look at what is there. Yes, it is 10:30 and time for our first panel. Many thanks again to Eric. He put his email in the chat for those of you that didn't hear his extra bonus points there. And he invited anybody of the all 189 of you to email him. He says he's an email addict. Well, we may cure him of that. Anyway, many thanks again, Eric. So our panel for the rest of our session this morning is called Written in Water and Sand: What the Drying of the Rio Grande Means to Our Communities. Laura Pascus is the moderator, and Laura, if we watch In Focus on Friday night on PBS, which I never miss, we see Laura and the great job she does on Our Land, Mexico's Environmental Past, Present, and Future segments. So Laura, I hope you are here. We're also joined by Kaiti Blue Sky, wildlife biologist, Santa Fe Indian School, Cochiti Pueblo. And this is so hard because usually everybody's sitting up front at a table together, and now they're just scattered around the screen. So it takes some imagination. And Phoebe Swina is with us, President, High Water Mark, LLC, from Cochiti Pueblo and San Felipe Pueblo. And finally, Gabe Vasquez, City Councilor in Las Cruces and part of the Nuestra Tierra Conservation Project. So Laura, I hope you are here. I'm not seeing you, but there are many screens. If you will make yourself known, that would be great. And I just want to point out that I have a timer here that goes like this. And so Laura, tell me how much time you would like each of the presenters to have, and I will give them that sound when they have 1 minute left, if you'd like to do it that way. Ah, I see you, Laura. I found you. Good, thanks.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you so much. So we're going to have kind of a more informal conversation back and forth. So I don't think we'll need your timer. Although if I just keep going, if I keep going on and on, feel free to whack the timer. And
no, I'm not. I'm not gonna ding my bell for you. No, no. Well, that's great. Really look forward to it. Thanks.
All right. So hi, everyone. Eric is a really tough act to follow. I'm a huge fan of his. His book is great. And I miss getting to see him in person, like so many of you. It's great to see your faces on little tiny screens. I wish we were all together. I'm going to give you a warning ahead of time that we adopted a brand new puppy last night. And my office is in between the door to the backyard and the rest of the house. So there may be an emergency teenager running through with a puppy going to the bathroom. So y'all might see that, and I'm sorry in advance. So I hope that I saw that Phoebe was here. I haven't scrolled through everybody. I hope that everybody's here. I'm gonna act like they are. So I'm a reporter, like Lucy mentioned, and there's so many of you in the audience today whose expertise I really appreciate. You have been steadfast scientists and water managers and sources, and I appreciate so much that you all do and so much that the Water Dialogue does. And I am also really grateful to our three panelists this morning. I don't think that Kaiti and I have ever met in person, but I'm a huge fan of the work that he does. Phoebe Swina is a longtime friend and someone whose work I respect so much. And Councilman Gabe Vasquez, who I also know through Nuestra Tierra, is doing fantastic work in southern New Mexico. And so rather than kind of me introducing them, I'd much rather have each of them just talk for a few minutes about themselves and their work and kind of what you each would like the rest of us to understand about you. So if you don't mind, just because I know she's here, I'd love to start with Phoebe Swina.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Okay. Good morning, everybody. Goatsi Hopa. That's just saying hello to everybody in our Karis language. Hope all of you are staying healthy and safe during these trying times navigating the pandemic. And I just want to take a few minutes and introduce myself. My name, as Laura said and Lucy said, and I'm so happy to be here with my friends Lucy and Laura. And my brother Kaiti, I hope he's online here. And I know Councilman Vasquez from some work we did a few months ago for the outdoor recreation grant program. And so I'm so happy to be here, and I see a lot of other faces, familiar faces. As Laura said, I'm from the Cochiti Pueblo area of Pueblo. My dad's from there. My mother's from San Felipe Pueblo. And I just wanted to, again, thank our keynote speaker for setting us, and of course, State Engineer John D'Antonio, who's a friend and colleague as well, for their words and setting us forward today. And just so much to think about. And I think for me, my work with our Pueblo communities, in the field of water and in the field of natural resources, and looking at the intersection of where local, state, and federal policies overlap and interact, good or not, with local, tribal resources and our own tribal sovereignty and our tribal governments. So that's kind of the area that I work in currently, and I hope to work in the near future. And I also have some background in navigating post-fire flooding in the East Jemez Mountain area, both after the Cerro Grande fire as well as the Las Conchas fire. So I just appreciate this time, and I look forward to a great panel. And thank you so much, Laura, for moderating. Talk to you all soon. Bye.
Let's head to Councilman Vasquez.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you to everybody who's here today. I hope that you can hear me okay. Sometimes I have connection issues with this many folks on a Zoom meeting, but it is amazing to see so many folks here that care clearly about our water resources and about our beautiful state that we all hopefully want to be able to pass down in the best possible condition to our next generation of New Mexicans. And I'll start by saying that my first introduction to the Rio Grande, or to the Rio Bravo, which we'll be talking about here later, was on a fishing trip. So I grew up with my dad and brother in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and actually visited the Caballo Lake Reservoir and State Park when I was 7 or 8 years old. And it was a very impactful experience for me. One, because it was the first time I ever saw the Rio Grande in more of a natural condition, because in El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, it has been channelized, militarized, and just completely diverted and controlled as a national security, as a border, rather than as a free-flowing river, which is what I thought I was seeing when I was a kid in New Mexico. And that was an experience in which my father, actually a Mexican national, was arrested by Border Patrol and held at Truth or Consequences because they needed to verify his identity, because somebody using the river didn't think that we belonged there. They didn't think that we didn't have fishing licenses and that we shouldn't be there. So that was the first welcome I got into our river in New Mexico. And from there, it's really just sparked a passion in me to make sure that all people feel welcome out on our land, especially out on our river. And so the work I do today, both as the city councilor and with Nuestra Tierra, is really centered around this idea that our natural resources, and particularly water, should be available to everybody, that a living river is a human right to people who live on this land. And the way that we currently manage our water resources, and in particular the Rio Grande, doesn't necessarily reflect that. And it hasn't reflected that since we've turned water into a commodity, really for the profit of a few. And so I'll be talking a little bit about that in my remarks. And just some more background, I also, I spent some time working with New Mexico Wildlife Federation. So I'm a hunter, I'm an angler, a hiker, camper, and I just love being on the river and being on the land here in our beautiful state. And also had a chance to work with Martin Heinrich for a little while in his office. And now as a city councilor, part of the Utilities Commission, help manage our city utilities, and understanding some of the challenges that face us as a municipality is something I've recently gotten to learn more about, and facing those challenges here in Las Cruces as well. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Councilman. Mr. Blue Sky, are you on the call? I kind of scrolled through. I didn't know if you're there. I'll wait a second. Lucy, do you see him on the list anywhere?
I'm looking, Virginia, can you look at the same time too? So if it's alphabetical
You can just, you can search in the search window at the top of the participant window.
Oh, do it.
This is Phoebe. He just texted me and he said he's having some connectivity issues, so he's trying to get to another location to get connectivity.
Okay, thank you, Phoebe. Will you let him know to just jump in or chat or something, and we'll break him into the conversation.
Okay.
So today, so there was a loud crash behind me, likely puppy related. Sorry. So in water management circles, we talk a lot about what the river does for us in terms of water for cities, water for farms. And in the past few decades, water managers have had to talk more about and take action on endangered species and ecosystems. And we talk about things like ecosystem services. Eric offered a great overview of water accounting and laws and things like that. And I know this week, like always with Water Dialogue, there'll be great conversations about science and climate change. But with this panel, I want to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about our feelings and our feelings about how our rivers, like the Rio Grande, are a part of our communities and a part of our culture and a part of our sort of larger connection to the past and the future. And so I appreciate everyone's indulgence. I know we don't always talk about feelings in contexts like this one. And so Phoebe, I just wanted to start with you because we've talked about this a little bit back and forth over the years. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship that you have and that your community has with the Rio Grande, and how that has changed over the past decades with things like construction of Cochiti Dam, and even now as we're seeing dwindling stream flows or post wildfire floods and sedimentation of the reservoir. And so just talk a little bit sort of broadly, if you don't mind, about your connection, your community's connection with the Rio Grande and how that has changed over the past half century or so.
Thank you so much for that question, Laura. And I was wondering if, Jeffrey, if you could put my slides up that I prepared. I'm a very visual person, so I like to kind of talk to some of the visuals to address Laura's question that she just shared with us. And really for me, it's looking at the revitalization of our indigenous perspectives to help us move forward for stewardship and management as we're all talking this conversation. If you can go to the next slide. And so in respect to Laura's question, I think as we heard today, we have some certain constraints, physical constraints, limitation, natural resources constraints. I have a master's in environmental engineering, And so as an engineer in our formal education, you look at your constraints, your variables, to try to come up with a solution as how to address a certain challenge or a problem. And so from my engineering, my formal education standpoint, I'm looking at that perspective. And so one other thing that I always, since graduating from my master's program and coming home, one of the things that I think addresses Laura's question is revitalizing and reintegrating myself once I was done with my formal education back into our Pueblo culture and our Pueblo traditions and our Pueblo ceremonies and our Pueblo education system that is inherently rooted in our language. And so I'm blessed, I'm very blessed to have the traditional and core values in our Pueblo, from our Pueblo communities. And those are values and knowledge and expertise that go back thousands of years. There's a term that they say, since time immemorial. And as carried through our oral tradition and our language, those lessons, those expertise, that is carried through in our language. And so I know often many of the folks here on the dialogue this morning have heard me say, we are the first hydrologists, Pueblo people, first hydrologists, first engineers, first ecologists, first chemists, first botanists, first policymakers in this landscape that we call New Mexico. And I think for Pueblo people and indigenous people, that's the perspective we're looking at. And I liked this morning when Eric was talking about, how things have evolved. And yes, they've evolved because of the policies, the federal government, the influx of the Europeans and other communities and other peoples into this land. But I also like to remember, as resilient as we are as Pueblo people, that we are on our third government. We've been here since the Spanish government, the Mexican government, and now the US federal government. And I like, again, Eric's comment about, people think adjudications forever. At the time, how the Spanish saw water, they thought this was going to be the law forever. At the time, how the Mexican government saw the management of water, they thought this was going to be the law forever. And so as Pueblo people, we've seen this iteration of various forms of government policies overlap into how we manage and steward and navigate our natural resources. So I like this little graphic. So for those that are visual, so in the graphic, we have, the lawyers understand a piece of the pie. If this whole pie is the how we understand water, the lawyers understand a portion, the chemists understand a portion, the engineers understand a portion, the ecologists, the hydrologists, and those other. And for me as a Pueblo person, the other thing that I like to look at is, because we have so much expertise in this landscape and in New Mexico, we look at our Pueblo people and especially our traditional leadership, understanding a huge, and the ability to understand and comprehend a larger piece of the pie. And that's through our sacred knowledge, and that knowledge and expertise has been brought down since time immemorial. There's also portions that I will never understand about water, and concepts and details about how water is, how it's living, how it is not necessarily just a commodity. It's not necessarily just a quantification of how many cubic feet per second. I can talk about that in engineering concepts. So, but that is not the whole pie of how we understand water. So if you can go real quick, and I'm gonna try to make this quick. So for me, when I came home, it was recentering and refocusing on our Pueblo and indigenous values so that I could have a better understanding of water, but also be able to speak the engineering language, to speak the policy language, to speak the language of the chemists, of the ecologists, so that we can start as Pueblo people to share what our core values and how we look at water and managing not just water, but other natural resources. So I'm sure you've seen many of these, you know, the respect for all, that balance. And then living and planning, as someone said earlier in this dialogue, for current generations as well as future generations, that sustainability and that resiliency, as we've been here since time immemorial as Pueblo people. But the unique thing is in that pie, as I talked about, the intricate interdependency of everything. Me as Phoebe Swina, I'm not solely here all by myself. And in this hour of time, I'm connected to the other hours of times before and after this time period. So there's a unique interdependency that we look at, and it's a very complex system. And so to answer your question, I'll stop there on my slides, but to answer your question, Laura, I think for me, it's been more of a revitalization and a refocusing on our indigenous and core values in respect to this larger framework of laws and policies, engineering concepts, ecology concepts, chemistry concepts, and then trying to explain the holistic and looking at a sustainable approach for managing and stewarding our resources. Again, not just for me, not just for the community of Cochiti or the community of San Felipe, or even the communities of New Mexico, but of the entire world. We are just but one little spot in interconnection, all of us, in this entire complexity that we talk about, whether we're talking about the hydrologic cycle or whether we're talking about other ecosystems. So I hope I answered your question, Laura.
Yeah, and so in terms of like how the Rio Grande, like how people in your communities and I know you can't speak for everybody or anyone but yourself, but how the Rio Grande, like what kind of a relationship people have with the river on a day-to-day basis or a seasonal basis, and how that kind of ties into community, and maybe how that has changed over time, and maybe how you would like to see it change again for better ways, maybe.
Absolutely. So I think for me and my family, I can share this from this perspective, you know, I am just a tribal member. I'm not a tribal leader, not a council member, or hold any position within the Pueblo other than a tribal membership. But how I teach as a mother, my kids, how I talk to my father as a daughter, to my brothers and sisters at the Pueblo, we talk about our relationship to the river. And it is an in-depth, unique relationship that it's a symbiotic relationship where we need the river to flow, to live in essence. We look at the river as not just a commodity, not just a quantification of how many cubic feet per second are flowing. We don't just look at it as just how much we need for our fields, but this symbiotic relationship in that we need the river and the river needs us. The river not only needs us, but it also needs its whole body, which is the hyporheic zone, the groundwater, the plants, the animals, the sediment, the nutrients, all of those complexities. That's what the river needs in order for it to sustain itself and be healthy to sustain itself and bring that health and that well-being, not just again to us as Pueblo or Cochiti people, but to all of those that are downstream and upstream users. And so in addition is we utilize the river for ceremonial purposes, and some on a daily basis. So if the river does not flow, how do we maintain that traditional and Pueblo and Cochiti specific way of life? And my brother Kaiti, I know he's not on here, he's my first cousin, but I call him my brother. he always says this is, we as Coche de Pueblo people, we are endangered species. Because if you look from an ecologist standpoint, we are a people that need, have certain needs within our environment. And when the essential needs of the environment are threatened, then so are we threatened or endangered. And so we need the river to sustain our Coche de Pueblo way of life, for our ceremonies, for our even some of our daily activities, as well as we are agricultural people. So we borrow the water to grow crops. That's what I teach my kids. This isn't ours, right? This isn't ours. It's our water to own. It is a borrowing process so that we can grow sustainably, and then we give back everything we have, whether we grow things or whether we harvest from the hills, birds, rabbits, whatever, we give back to the river. And so, like I said, there's that symbiotic relationship and that interdependency between us. So, but that whole complexity, and I can't share every in-depth nuance to that because of sacred knowledge, but just those are the general concepts, if I can use ecology terminology or even engineering terminology to explain to the mainstream folks.
Thank you, Phoebe. I'm going to jump to Councilman Vasquez for a few minutes. Mr. Blue Sky is on.
Laura, Kaiti is on. I see him on the screen.
Okay.
So just wanted to let you know. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just gonna I'm gonna pop a couple 100 miles south from where Phoebe is talking about. Councilman Vasquez, can you talk about, I mean, the lower Rio Grande in New Mexico is in such an interesting situation in that section of the river doesn't flow for most of the year unless it's being used to deliver irrigation water. Can you talk about what that, how that affects your relationship with the river and the landscape there, and how it feels to be at that end of the system, looking upstream?
Sure, Laura, thank you. And I do have a couple of prepared slides here, just with some images that might help frame the context of your question. Jeffrey, I believe you have the presentation ready to queue up here. Thank you. If you can go on to the next slide there. Well, thank you so much for that question, Laura. And yes, I did want to just offer a little bit of perspective. I know the majority of folks here are familiar with obviously how our river is managed in New Mexico and some of the history behind it. But talking about, like you said, being in a downstream community in which the majority of the year we don't have a living river. We have all but a trickle of water in our river system here. I think it's just important to note that how this all started and how this all began. And so as Phoebe so eloquently described her relationship with the river and her community's relationship with the river, when the Spanish first colonized New Mexico, Pueblo people were already here using simple irrigation systems, sustainable irrigation systems that were diverting water from water resources, including the Rio Grande, to live in a healthy way with our water and with our environment. And so when American settlers began coming to New Mexico and they began thinking about how to develop a more intensive irrigation development of the Rio Grande watershed, one of the major projects that they created, as you all know, is Elephant Butte Reservoir as part of the Rio Grande project. And so that was a project that was designed to provide power and irrigation to South Central New Mexico and West Texas, and also control the water flow into Mexico. And so it was built, the reservoir itself and the dam was built and filled around the 1915 or 1916. And at that time, just to give you a perspective of how massive this dam really is and how important it was for folks to control the flow of water in the valley here in southern New Mexico is that it was the largest irrigation dam ever built at the time of its construction at that particular time. The construction of the dam has reduced the flow significantly of the Rio Grande for years, for decades, to just a small stream for most of the year here in southern New Mexico. And the only water that we get to see from our river is when it's released during the summer irrigation season. And every once in a while, when there are times of exceptional snow melt, which hasn't happened in quite some time. Now, to give you an idea of how many times the river is dammed south of Elephant Butte, we have Percha Dam, we have Leesburg Dam, we have Picacho North and the South Dams, we have Mesilla Dam, we have the American Diversion Dam in El Paso and the Riverside Diversion Dam in El Paso as well. So there is a very intense desire on the part of water managers to really make sure that irrigators are getting their respected water allotments every year. And so the water rights that we do have here in the valley are already doled out, and in fact are running short, right, in terms of the acreage that gets released every year and are continue to dwindle. But for those of us who aren't irrigators, for the majority of people who see the river in a much different way than just as a commodity, we're used to not seeing water. And so when people talk about drought and when people talk about just the dwindling snowpack, it's hard for your everyday southern New Mexico to imagine what impact that has on our communities, because we don't see water in our river anyway, which is just kind of, yeah, goes to show you what the mentality, I think, of a lot of folks that live in this part of the river. If you can move on to the next slide. What I also wanted to talk about, especially in relation to how we view the river here in southern New Mexico, is that there has been a legacy of injustice in agricultural production, especially in southern New Mexico, but also across the country, that really helps shape the view, I think, of how we view water resources, especially as a Mexican-American community down south. And so when controlling the water for irrigation for the benefit of farmers along the Rio really first began, it also came with it the need for labor. And that led to great injustices, particularly of Mexican workers. This particular photo are some participants in the Bracero program, which I really view today as just a systematic using and abusing of Mexican farm workers. Under the Bracero program, farm workers were often paid low wages when they were paid at all. They were often exposed to toxic chemicals like Zyklon B, DDT, and in fact, there's just a report that came out not too long ago about gasoline baths that Mexican farm workers were given on the border in El Paso, Texas, before they got to their posts to disinfect the immigrants before entering the United States. I'll also say that of the millions of braceros that were in this country, 5 million or more, only 10% of them were ever hired permanently as U.S. hired workers. The rest of them were sent back to Mexico. And in Texas, this program was actually banned for several years during the mid-1940s because of the discrimination and mistreatment of Mexicans, including various lynchings along the border. And so just to put into context of how we viewed agricultural production today, it's very much rooted in an abuse of labor, an abuse of people, an abuse of natural resources. And so it has led to, I think, the type of mentality that a lot of us have today, in which we see a channelized, militarized river and no water for the majority of the year. If you go on to the next slide. So ag in the valley today, what you see driving through I-10 in Las Cruces, or if you're driving on Valley Drive or heading down Main Street, is you will see obviously the massive pecan groves that exist here, especially in Doña Ana County, where just a handful of families, and I'll say wealthy pecan producing families, own the majority of the pecan acreage in the Mesilla and the Hatch valleys, and similarly also essentially own the water rights and are privy to the irrigation water from surface water in the Rio Grande, the majority of it here in the valley. I won't mention the families, but everyone who lives down here knows who they are. And so they control the majority of the pecan acreage that exists here. Again, the benefit, I think 2.4% of New Mexico's GDP in total is agriculture, but they receive 3/4 of the state's surface and groundwater. So there is also a great sense of inequality here for folks when they look at flood irrigated fields, and then conversely look over to the Rio Grande with a trickling of water, and you think about who is this water benefiting, right? Certainly the export GDP is really nice to have, but at the same time, is that all that humans need to live in harmony with their environment and in their community? If you move on to the next slide. I'll stop here at this slide, Laura, but just in terms of you know, how we use the river today and how we view it, I actually think that there is a reckoning, there is an awakening in our community of how our relationship is really tied with land and with water, and how our benefits than just the built environment. And so in the last 10 years alone, and through some of the work that we've been doing with Nuestra Tierra, and particularly with taking young, low-income youth outdoors, we have seen that people, when there is water in the river, that it changes the entire makeup of our community and changes the entire mindset of our community. And so, I believe, frankly, that water is a human right, that water should not be for the profit of a select few. And unfortunately, communities of color, low-income communities around the world, are the ones who disproportionately lack access to water. And so, I think we have a real opportunity to change the mindset of how we use water. And as Phoebe mentioned, these water rights that exist here in the system of irrigation and the GDP that we get from certain water intensive crops that we have here, that doesn't mean that it has to last forever. So I think that there's a greater awakening, I think, especially amongst the Hispanic community. Folks really care about the environment. Folks really care about our water resources. They want to see the system change. They want us to manage water better. They want us to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And they want to do things like this, right? They want to go rafting down the river, even if it's up to your knees, and it's not, and you have to get up and pull your raft when you get stuck on a sandbar, right? Even at the heaviest flow. They still think it's incredibly fun. They want to fish for catfish in those little holes and bicycle along the river. They want to run along a river trail where they can see a sunset, even coming down in the Mesilla Valley right next to the Robledo Mountains. So those are just really important things for our community, and part of our relationship with the river and the way we see it today can't be taken away from the events that really got us to where we are today.
Awesome, thank you, Gabe. I love ending that series of slides with people in acts of happiness and joy. That's really awesome. Mr. Blue Sky, thank you so much for finding a spot to join us. So if you wouldn't mind, just take a few minutes to introduce yourself, what you would like us to know about you and your work. And then we were just talking about how, obviously, like, when it comes to water management, there's science, there's the law, there's all these different factors, but our rivers mean more to us. They occupy places in our communities. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about yourself, your work, and then your community's relationships with the Rio Grande.
Well, first of all, thank you, Laura. Thank you to the staff for allowing me to have to be here. Greetings, everybody. This is the way that we introduce ourselves and being respectful to who we are and where we come from. My name is Kaiti Blue Sky. My English name, my legal name is Leonard Victor Blue Sky. I've never went by Leonard. I found out Leonard was my first name when I was in high school. And so Kaiti is my name as my community and my family and clan, everybody knows me as. So Kaiti is my name. I went to New Mexico State University. I'm an Aggie, so I'm well aware of Las Cruces and the Rio Grande as it travels south of Albuquerque. As it doesn't flow very well south of Albuquerque, and has been a strong going point to share with our locals up north of that the river doesn't run all the way south, and how grateful we ought to be. The dam being a double-edged sword that provides for water for our future generations, but also very devastating in the impacts of when it was first created relative to ancestral areas. Again, my name is Kaiti Blue Sky, born and raised here in Coach T. Pueblo. And I greatly appreciate the conversations my sister Phoebe was talking about, and wanted to. I know I'm short on time, but one thing that I really open up conversations with is asking people, what is your definition of value? And for me, that harks back to their own personal priorities, and it really reflects their goals as an individual, but also it's a reflection of their family and their communities. And so, you know, I can only share what my grandma and grandpa shared as relating back to what this place means to us. And so when I ask people their idea of value, many people will say money, will say capitalism, will say green economic growth, will say, and allude to those ideas. But when I ask my grandma and grandpa the same very questions, they hug the grandchildren. Our grandchildren, our Wekani, our language, our culture, the river that supports our way of life, the landscape that supports everything else. And this is what's of value. So the value systems is starkly different, and it can't be reiterated enough of this is the challenge that tribal people are embattled with since first contact. We didn't know how to sell the land, so the Dawes Act showed us how to put a fence up and call a parcel of land and put money on it. So, you know, our ideas were, you can't sell the land, you can't, how are you going to buy the air? Well, they showed us that part. And so the realization of the many different agencies, the many different non-governmental agencies and their goals and obligations are really suited for that small interest group. But never, not never, but very rarely does it include this concept of value system, of what tribes have been harking on since first contact, is that this land has a soul, this land has a spirit, water is alive, and that's how you get to the cubic foot per second of how to sell it. But when you're talking about putting a name, a spirit to that value system of the river, it's no longer a river, it's a relative, it's family. And so it goes back into that idea of, you know, having a human legal right for that river. If corporations can do it, why not the river? And it doesn't speak to the river just in a locality of Las Cruces or Cochiti, it speaks to the entire watershed, which goes back into Colorado. And having that protection of every tributary, every single spring as a human being, because that's the way we see the springs, that's the way we see the mountain peaks, as a direct relation to give us cues of how to continue our ceremonial way of life. So it's not just us here in Cochiti, but the landscape that shows, that reveals our own connection. And so, you know, going back to solstices and equinoxes, you know, Cochiti doesn't have a sundial. Cochiti is a sundial. So Chaco Canyon has Fajada Butte with the sun daggers. Well, Cochiti is a living sun dagger. Cochiti is a living sundial that goes back into our connection to the mountains, that connects to Bandelier, which was stolen from us, which Jose Hilario from Cochiti showed Bandelier, our northern boundary, and it was taken. And so, if going back to landscape and what this landscape means, it's a relative, it's family. And so I think a strong going point globally is how do we move forward with seeing the world having a soul and a spirit. to be able to protect the mountains behind us as a living being through perhaps traditional cultural properties, because it's not about skin color, it's not about race, it's about worldview, truly. And I think that leads to ideas of how we can move forward with the Amazon burning for development of agriculture, to the Wanganui River in New Zealand having a human legal right, to Lake Erie, to having similar to Colorado River, to the Rio Grande River, to the Pecos River, and as well as the mountains. Because then it starts talking, like it was mentioned before, about contamination. We're 12 miles downstream from Los Alamos National Laboratories, and yet we're tasked with the burden to sample water when Albuquerque uses surface water for drinking, and then NEPA being rolled back, and then U.S. Fish and Wildlife and EPA being reorganized to watersheds. It leads in a different limelight if we talk about wanting this a new path, and traditional ecological knowledge and the wisdom from our grandmas and grandpas is not a thing of the past. It's the future. We're showing you grandma and grandpa's words and wisdom is showing us that we have the tools available, and we just need to believe in ourselves. That we have the answers, we have the knowledge, we have the capacity to come up with new ideas that reverberate to that consciousness of what is a priority in life. And I think it goes back to individuals of, asking yourself, what is a priority? And if you can name 7 things that are of priority to you, do your awakening days of coming out of bed and stepping out of bed to meet those priorities, is that a reality for you, or is it just talk? And I truly believe that's the same way as we engage this ever-changing world. To going back to the priorities of what is a necessity for humanity to survive, not just our community, not just my family, but the world. And if wildlife don't have my background. I came out of New Mexico State with my background in wildlife and fisheries biology, and so wildlife are that perfect segue to that conversational piece, because wildlife don't have borders. But it was going back to what is essential for life and humanity in a global sense. That's pretty much it.
Thank you so much for that. I think, seeing all of your faces today and having this conversation, it's a little bit heartbreaking to be apart. These are challenging times for everyone, and our physical distance is, it hits me during these times when we have these really important and really intimate conversations, and yet we're all so far apart. But I also feel like COVID and these multiple crises that we're dealing with that are likely happening, in other places right now as we're talking, I also feel like wildly hopeful in a way that I never have before in my life, that we're having conversations like these and bigger forums and more publicly to be talking about these justice issues and these ways of thinking about the world that we should be doing, and also that we need to set aside. And so thank you, all 3 of you. Oh, sorry, did you want to add something?
Yeah, real quick, I apologize. When we're in our ancestral homelands in the mountains, some things come to the surface as of the beauty of being in the mountains and back in our homelands. The beauty of it is that essentials of life come to the surface. Our petty grievances with individuals of, I don't like you, I don't like your family, I don't like your political stance, I don't like what you stand for, that all goes away. And so when you're on top of a mountain hiking, you're looking at, do you have enough water? Do you have clean water to drink? Do you have enough food? And it starts relating back to community and who's with you to help you survive. And it relates back to those basic fundamentals of wanting clean water, wanting adequate food, and you know that's the pinnacles of humanity, is that survival. And that's what it goes back to solstices and equinoxes and the astronomy, if you will, because it all goes back to seasonal changes and temperature. But that uniqueness of astronomy and the stars is a binding, because no matter where you're at in the world, we're tied to that cyclic change of solstices and equinoxes, which relates back to precipitation and life. But stripping away our petty human grievances and looking at what is essential for life to sustain, which is a healthy ecosystem.
So kind of drawing on that and the conversation and a number of the questions and comments that are in the chat right now, I'm curious if any of the three of you have ideas of how we as a state can ensure that these sort of non-quantitative uses of water are in fact truly protected into the future. And again, I mentioned the puppy, and I'm sorry, there are totally puppy and cat issues happening all around me, and I'm so sorry. But if anybody has answers.
Well, if I may, Gabe and Kaiti, so I think, forums like this are essential to carrying on that respectful and common sense conversations that include all perspectives, right? But in addition to this, we also need to have those voices like Councilor Vasquez in his political realm. We need to have that diversity of our leadership and in various political spheres, whether we're talking policymakers, or now we have hopefully Representative Holland in a potential position for Secretary of Interior. We hopefully, she is one of those indigenous Pueblo women that have brought that perspective to the halls of Congress. So we need to also leave open and the ability to listen to all perspectives. And so as we continue to work together to navigate collectively, as my brother Kaiti said, we're not in this all by ourselves. And even as Pueblo people, I look back, there's on YouTube, there's a discussion about an old man from Cochiti explaining how we are at Cochiti. I think it was taken in the early 1900s. And listening to him, it was, to me, sharing it with my kids, just talking about, as Kaiti said, what are the perspectives of people coming in and understanding that, but not judging it, but just allowing those voices and perspectives to all have a space at the table. And knowing that the lawyers don't know everything, respectfully, the engineers don't know everything, again, very respectfully, nobody knows everything. We all need these different perspectives and expertise to be at the table. And again, I would also recommend to the state policymakers, and I know I've talked to the state engineer, John D'Antonio, about this. I've talked to other leadership about this, is essential are the indigenous people of New Mexico to be at the table. Again, why do we make a decision based on something so essential that we've been managing, stewarding for thousands of years, where we have that encyclopedia that goes back for thousands of years of data points, if you will, practices, lessons learned of what worked, what didn't work, versus making decisions based upon what is in a written book that only spans maybe 100 years. Making decisions based on 100 years of data, or do you want to make decisions based on thousands of years of data and information? And if you want to make decisions based on thousands to time immemorial years of data and information, that means having the indigenous people of this land at the table. So as we go forward, I'm hoping again to send that message. And I also challenge my fellow brothers and sisters, indigenous brothers and sisters, to also get educated so that we can converse with those engineers, with the lawyers, with the chemists, with the botanists, with the ecologists, to speak that language, but come from our core values and perspectives. So thank you so much for that question, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. And Phoebe, thank you so much for putting it in such great words about being inclusive of who benefits from our natural resources and where we can begin to reprioritize how we manage everything from water to land to wildlife, to everything that we are extracting out of the ground in this state, and for what reason and to what end. I will say one of the reasons I ran for office was because I was really frustrated as an advocate, having to continuously ask our elected leaders to do the right thing. And it took often so much work and so much gatekeeping just to convince some certain leaders of our state to do common sense things. And when there's no political will built up to change systems, it's very difficult, because you have industry, all the beneficiaries of the way that we currently use our water, and I'm talking primarily financial beneficiaries or other natural resources, will always have a seat at the table when decisions are made about legislation or regulation or administrative actions, because their future profit depends on it. And so their lobbyists and their representatives will always be in the offices of our respective elected officials. But if we are to change the way that we value things like the Rio Grande, then we need to make sure we're at those tables as well. And even better yet, as you mentioned, with Representative Deb Haaland taking a spot potentially as our Secretary of Interior, that we are also lifting up those leaders who are willing to make change, who are willing to carry the values of our communities and not necessarily the communities of profit into these decision-making bodies and opportunities. And so I think that's really important, is that if there's no political will built up to change the systems, then nothing will change. And oftentimes that's a game a lot of people don't want to play, and understandably so, because politics aren't very fun, especially in today's environment. Even in times of COVID with limited interaction, has become even more difficult to engage with local, state, and federal governments. And so that's one thing just to keep in mind, is that change will come if we all stand up for it, if we all force our elected leaders to think and value the things that we do in our communities that they represent. And it's often difficult, but I know that there's some amazing folks on this part of this dialogue here today that I see that are doing that work, that are continuing to ask for change, that are mobilizing communities, getting petitions, introducing new legislation, fighting things like the Gila River diversion, all kinds of, really important water justice, social justice issues for our communities. And so it's going to take more of that building of political will in our state to be able to do that. And it's something that, especially I'll talk for my community, for low-income Mexican American families, our top priorities are keeping food on the table, making sure that our kids can be in school, and hopefully having 1 or 2 jobs that pay enough bills just to duck our heads down and be able to get by. And so political advocacy is not something that comes natural or comes easy to many communities that are most impacted when we do use our natural resources in a way that benefits profit and the extractive industries. And so it's going to be a challenge, but I think we can get there. We just have to begin to make sure that we know where the change is made and how to advocate for it.
So there's a question from Alex Webster that I think is really important in the chat. And he asks, given the exploitation and marginalization of your communities and worldviews, what are some of the main challenges of approaching these water dialogues, negotiations, and careers within these settler frameworks? And how do you manage those challenges to do everything you're succeeding in doing? And he thanks everyone for bringing these perspectives. And I really think this is a really important discussion to have here at the Water Dialogue. Kind of, what are the challenges for being a part of these conversations?
You want, sorry, I'm always going first. I was trying to give Gabe and Kaiti the chance, but yeah, it is so hard as we talk, dealing with the trauma of colonialism, dealing with the trauma and marginalization of our communities, in particular the indigenous communities, as Jason shared at the very beginning. It's just right now where we are in January 2021, as we navigate COVID pandemic, it just so highlighted all the disparities and all of everything that is impacting and the situations that we have within our tribal and indigenous communities. And when we talk about water, right? It's something that's so essential. As Eric said in the chat, we are made up of water. I mean, that's what data shows. That's what science shows. We all know that, right? So we all need water. We all need clean water to be healthy as well. Whether we're talking about what happened in Michigan with the Flint water issue, whether we're talking about what's happening in Cochiti and the impacts of Los Alamos National Laboratory, whether we're talking about, the fact that in the mid 1900s, the Army Corps of Engineers imposed a large earthen dam structure right on top of one of the most sacred areas of the Southwestern, all the tribal communities. And that was before NEPA, before the EPA, before all those environmental protections were developed. So yeah, we have had a great deal of trauma. That said, if you speak to, I was listening to somebody and you speak to somebody from one of the tribal and indigenous communities, we are still yet some of the most welcoming peoples, as well as our Hispanic neighbors, even though we are so marginalized and we have so much trauma. And so we have this balance, right, of how do we move forward? And we've taken a lot. But as always, as a Pueblo person, I've always been taught to go with respect. Our grandpa and grandma that raised Kaiti and I, my grandma, there'd be people talking bad about her, or trying to like put her in a corner, and then they come and she would come into the room and say, "Kuatsi, kuatsi," which means, "How are you?" It didn't matter if that person talked bad about her or try to do something. And that's what she showed us through how she carried herself with such grace. And so again, as leaders, whether leaders within our company or leaders within a political sphere, is always carrying yourself with respect. And also treating others with respect. So as we have these big conversations about what has been done to our communities, it's how do we frame it in a way that we can be heard and those things can be understood by others that are listening. And so for me, it's this constant, everyday consistent approach of always trying to have take those opportunities to work with people, to work on challenges, to say, yeah, I can help. I can try to help this process and help walk this line and provide a perspective. It's not going to be perfect, right? Right now, we're not in a perfect world. Nothing is going to be perfect. And it's just always working every day on that. And I also wanted to bring one other perspective before I forget. I know we're going on time, but Eric had mentioned earlier in his talk about New Mexico not being kind of not resource rich, right? We're limited on water, we're in a desert. And I wanted to share this perspective from an elder that passed on, one of our traditional leaders in Cochiti. And when I was young, he was telling me a story about, past leadership and past folks. And we were talking about water, and we were talking about agriculture, and we were talking about how everything fits within our community. And one thing he said, he said, Geishbiats, that's my Indian name. Geishbiats, we as Pueblo people, we were not meant to have pishte, which means a whole bunch. And the reason why, he said, that's okay. Here in New Mexico, where we are, we were not meant to have pishte. We were not meant to have a lot. Not a lot of money, peso, not a lot of crops, not a lot of water, not a lot of anything. We were meant to have a sustainable amount. He didn't use sustainable, I'm paraphrasing the native, but we were meant to have enough. Wash, enough. That's what it means. And so, and the reason why we were meant to have just enough is because that ensured that we did not take anything for granted. We didn't take for granted clean water. We didn't take for granted the crops that we grew every year. We didn't take for granted our family and the people that we have. That we always held and remembered not to take those things for granted. So again, it's that balancing act. And so as I look at this question, it's always trying to bring those other perspectives, but also knowing like we have to continue to educate and talk about this with policymakers, with engineers, and other decision makers, like Gabe was mentioning, even those business folks. So why I'm in the business world as a business owner is so that now I can talk to the business folks and saying, look, I get you. I understand. I got to balance my business budget as well, just like you do. I run a business. I understand that. So I can speak the business discussion and the terminology now. And so again, it's making sure that we also educate ourselves as Indigenous and local community members and have the opportunity, right, to have that education, that formal education, whether it's getting a degree or through college or even work on the job. I always tell my my boyfriend, he graduated, I'm calling him out here, but he graduated from high school, and he, for a lot of reasons, he didn't get his higher education. But I still tell him he is one of the smartest and wisest men I know, because his education came from his grandfather that lived into his mid-hundreds. So back to that encyclopedia, back to time immemorial. I know everything shuts down. I'm so glad I have him in my corner, because he is one of the most smartest and wisest people I know. And so again, to value those perspectives and to incorporate those perspectives in good decision making.
Kaiti, did you have your hand up also?
Yes, I going back to, I guess I want to frame the perspective just a little bit more through a quick story. In the younger days, there was a person with Down syndrome, and the grandpa said, don't you dare make fun of this boy. He was made this boy to be able to be with us as equals. He was so powerful, he was going to rule the world. And the Almighty made him this way, whether it be Down syndrome or have a disability. The Almighty made him this way so that he could be with us as equals. And that he was gonna rule the world. And if you're ever to wrestle someone with Down syndrome, they're super strong because the idea is that they still retain this power, this strength, this Maya on you. And so for our grand folks and to respect the person with Down syndrome, to honor, to respect him, that they're family, they're with us, they're equals with us because they're going to rule the world kind of powerful, and they still retain that power like Xerxes of 300. That's our, a perspective that I grew up with, that I'll share with. On the flip side, you have Western ideas of Down syndrome, which this person is missing a chromosome. Their mom was probably drinking with her. They go to that school. They're not smart like us. They read in that bus. They're different. And so the indifference was they're not like us. There's something's wrong with them. But to my grandpa, he was to be honored, to be respected. And I tell this story to hark back to the way that we view the world. If the world was your mother, how do you treat your mother? And something we've been saying for a long time is Mother Earth, Father Sky. And this is the way you would treat your mom. And that relates back to that connection of having these places, these mountains, these rivers. They're not just adamant. They have a name. They're recognized as individuals. They have a spirit. But like that kid with Down syndrome, for our communities, respect, honor, love them. But for outside, they're over there. They're different. They ride in that bus. They're different. But it's a stark reality of how we view the world, and something as precious as water. Thank you.
And I'll add to that. Thank you, Kaiti and Phoebe, again, for amazing responses. To dial in that question a little bit more, for me, in my own personal life, it's been about code switching, right? And I think you hear that from a lot of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, is that with their community, whether it's their family or their friends, you're used to speaking a certain language, you're used to carrying with you a certain value set, you're used to having things that you can identify with your relatives with. And when you enter an academic or a professional world that is dominated primarily by a system that values your educational achievement or attainment or your level of knowledge on a certain topic, you have to be able to speak the language, as Phoebe said, oftentimes just to be taken seriously or just for your opinion to matter. This is something that I pay special attention to, even in such requests that I get in my job as a city councilor, where a person might want a new street light on in their neighborhood because they think it's too dark. And my answer could be, well, the lumen output of the particular line that we'll be able to get from the established electrical grid that we have just doesn't satisfy the opportunity for you to have a light unless we put a new infrastructure that's going to cost thousands of dollars. And right now our budget is at X and Y. That's not the response that person wants to hear. That person does not feel valued when they hear that. And I think similar when we talk about water and water discussions and in water dialogue, we have talked today about a set of values of what brings us and what connects us to these resources, and speaking about the education that we've received from our elders and from our grandfathers in our community is a much different value set and is spoken in a much different language that is just as important as talking about CFS or talking about recharge or any other number of things that encompass a hydrologic system, right? And so I think that's a really good question and something that we have to account for, especially in really high-level professions like water engineering, where you do want to make the best decisions. You want to develop the best water systems that benefit the most people, but it does require an ability to learn and to listen from those communities who will be impacted by the work that you're doing, and oftentimes that is spoken in a different language with different values.
So I hope that everyone is getting a chance also to be reading the comments and questions in the chat, which are amazing and awesome. And I wanted to, there's so many good conversations going on, but I wanted to draw attention in particular to a comment in the chat from State Engineer D'Antonio, because I think what he brings up here is a really important point for us to talk about in lots of contexts, but especially today. He wrote, there are many water users and environmental groups that think Cochiti Dam is the linchpin to solve the Middle Rio Grande Endangered Species Act issues. Through federal legislation, there's been a move to require flow deviations to store and release water for silvery minnow recruitment and ESA critical habitat, to the detriment of Cochiti Pueblo, with further inundation of additional Pueblo cultural sites. And that's another important reason to have tribes, pueblos, and nations at the table. There's so many issues like this across the state. This one is one that I think about a lot because the Rio Grande is the river that's in my community. I'm curious for the three panelists if there are some other issues within the state, and I know there are many, but that are really, really critical, that there need to be more voices at the table right now in particular.
You want to take that, Salman Mekaiti?
You go first. Go right ahead. I'll follow your lead.
And so I appreciate that from State Engineer D'Antonio, and John is such a been a good friend and colleague as in his profession. And so I know he poses that question and shares that question with an understanding of the complexities that Cochiti has with the Cochiti Lake and the dam itself. As I mentioned earlier, in the mid 1900s, to have the dam imposed upon Cochiti, still to this day, even as I'm talking right here, it hits me in my gut. And I mean, I think you know, I still every day going by that dam, it just scars the landscape. It's a scar on Cochiti Pueblo lands. It's an immense imposition, not only to Cochiti, but to many tribes in New Mexico and in Arizona, because of the damage it's done. And you know, there's that ongoing thing where I don't know. I was born in the 1970s. I don't know what Cochiti means or looks like without the dam there. And so just framing it in that perspective for everybody to share with everybody is, and then to hear the stories of our grandma and grandpa and our great grandmas and great grandpas and our uncles and fathers about how the China, how about the river was and how it flowed and how necessary that is to Cochiti people, as well as the other indigenous peoples in New Mexico, how the river flowed and what that dam did to the flow of the river in this particular location. And so there's a lot of trauma, a lot of chips on the shoulder. But that said, is going forward, how do we continue to have that seat at the table? So yes, we carry that, and we carry that trauma in our hearts, in our bones, in our blood. But how do we effectively sit at the table and talk with the state engineer, talk with the Army Corps of Engineers? How do we manage that? And again, it's making sure that we don't forget what this area means. We don't forget what the dam did, not just to Cochiti, not just to the indigenous people, but the whole world. And Cochiti Dam is not the only dam that has had this impact to the whole world. I mean, the hydrologic cycle, right, is not something that is only right here in New Mexico. It's a worldly, it involves the whole world. So, so again, sitting at the table, looking at this short-term time frame, that dam has a 100-year lifespan. So it was built in the 1960s, finished out, finally completed in 1970s. So by the time I'm 100, maybe I'll live to be 100 years old. We do have long genes in our family. So we just about a year ago, my grandpa's brother passed away. He was about 101, 102. So there's a possibility. But we teach our kids what this area means, and we teach them how they will navigate these conversations, because it's going to be their decision. It's going to be their responsibility of how to manage that entity that's there now. And when I talk to young kids, when sometimes Kaiti invites me to his class, I tell them, I said, one day, this place that we all know by different names, it's going to happen again. It's going to be again. You will see it, maybe your kids will see it. But how the river flowed in this location, how the river swirled in this location, you may see it, or your kids may see it. And for me to say that, and I can't use those terms here in a public forum, but for them to hear it, I've heard young kids say, "Oh my God, that's crazy." Even our peers, our brothers and sisters that we have at the Pueblo saying, "One day it will happen." And so it's preparing our youth, preparing those yet to be born, to be able to converse and have a seat at the table. But for us right now, to be able to reach out, and again, in a respectful and meaningful manner, to come up not with the solution, but with ways to address and manage and steward the dam in this time frame that we have. The constraint is it's got a 100-year lifespan. Okay, that's the constraint. Pueblo, our Cochiti people are going to be here beyond that. So we hope, and I ask the state engineer and I ask federal partners, and I know the Army, Ryan from the Army Corps of Engineers probably has heard me say this, is like, you've got a very short time frame here. We are going to be here for generations beyond your time frame. So help us manage and steward the lands and the resources and what we do with the dam during this 100-year time frame. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Greetings of hello, familiar faces out there. What I'm speaking about is the sustainability of the ecosystem that we're a part of, and that our culture is intricately entwined with our cultural way of life. And this is our ceremonial calendar. And there are no gray areas when it comes to survival. Either we continue with our cultural way of life or we don't. We are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. Our culture is threatened, our language, our philosophies, our worldview, our perspective, our perception of the universe. And as Phoebe mentioned before, we're endangered species. We're walking jaguars. And our ancestral domain is our critical habitat. In the year 2063, I will be celebrating my 80th birthday. And when you think of the future, my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, maybe they'll spend the day with me. Maybe they'll ask me about you. Maybe they'll ask about this conference. Maybe they'll ask about who are all the people here back in 2021. Maybe they'll ask me why we didn't do anything while there was still time. What we do or don't do will affect our entire way of life, our children, our grandchildren, and beyond. And what we do or don't do, our children's generations cannot undo in the future. And some people think that indigenous peoples are insignificant and it doesn't matter what we do, but united we can make a difference as humanity. But first, we must tear down the foreign construct of me, myself, and I, and reiterate the traditional knowledge and philosophies of we and us, not just for tribal nations, not just for my family, but for our global community, we and us, and leave behind the me, myself, and I. But to do that, we must speak clearly, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. And politicians only speak of green eternal growth because they're too scared of being unpopular and only speak of the same bad ideas that got us into this mess. Even though it is known and expressed of how significant this earth, our homelands, bandolier, our ancestrals are, some people are not mature enough to tell it like it is. And that burden is left on our generations to come. Our cultural way of life is interwoven with our ancestral domain and is continuously being proposed to be sacrificed for money. Our way of life is intertwined with this land. It is continually being sacrificed so others can live in luxury. People say love your children above all else, yet people continue to propose to steal our children's future right before our very eyes. We cannot solve the same problems with the same thinking we used to create them, says Einstein. And familiar faces and friends and family, Mr. Armijo, Ottoman, Rich Schrader, all familiar faces that we've talked about this many times. And that has been the trials and tribulations, is sharing that perspective, because it goes back to that in every single conversation. You know, what is in the lake? What's coming down the Santa Fe River? Why is the Santa Fe River being diverted when the Santa Fe River does still run through Cochiti? But it's systematic, and it's individuals to make this actual reality. To speak with communities as truly and sincerely, not just a checkbox. To have Corps of Engineers stand by Cochiti's side. If this is truly co-management, then where's the management? If we're to work with Forest Service as the co-managers, as equals, not afterthoughts, in the planning stages, at the table, as equals. As Phoebe has said, my sister has said, many times to the outside world, we have to throw down our documents to show our validity, that I know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about wildlife biology, when I'm talking about fisheries biology, when I'm talking about ecology, when I'm talking about hydrology, to be able to speak that lingo so that our credibility is justified. Otherwise, I'm just another brown face. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think I can probably speak for everybody here that we really appreciate you spending this time with us and sharing that perspective. And I am sad that we are out of time. I'll leave it up to Lucy or somebody if we have a few more minutes, but I'm sorry that we ran out of time. It felt like an hour and a half was going to be so long, and yet it was not.
Laura, this is Myron Armijo. I'd like to make a comment, please. Short comment.
Okay. Yes, of course, Myron.
Okay. I'm sorry?
Yes, of course, Myron, please.
Thank you, Lucy. All three of you in this discussion today, all of you provided a very good perspective of your backgrounds, not only from the Native side, but from the Hispanic culture, how you all grew up. That is great, okay? Decisions are made mostly every day, maybe many years back on different issues. However, there's still many issues that aren't resolved in Indian country and the entire state of New Mexico. That's what we're talking about today. We need to make sure that everyone participates in this 50-year water plan kickoff today, and that whatever way the communities decide to participate, we have to make sure that someone is at these discussions, so that we're not making decisions without someone that should have been at the table. And we're going forward with the plan. We're going forward. So it's vitally important that everybody needs to be at the table and participate. Like I said, there are many issues still to be resolved in Indian country, not only with the state, but the federal government, even with our agency. There's still issues hanging out there that need to be discussed and hopefully resolved. So thank you, all of you, for the discussion today. And Phoebe, go, Katie, the tribe fights control. Touch the mem with them, go memakum, and the tribe fights control. Just a little prayer for and expression of their participation today. So thank you so much.
Myron, thank you very much for weighing in there. Really important. The whole message about every voice participating when these decisions are made is very much the theme of the dialogue. And Laura, I'm so grateful to you. We all are, for your pulling together this panel, for your sorting out the richness of the questions in the chat. I don't know how you did that, but you really did a beautiful job pulling out some really important, provocative questions. And so much deep thanks to the three panelists, really, Gabe, Phoebe, KT. So appreciative of what you brought to us this morning. These are voices that apply to all of us. They're deep human voices connecting us all, and we need to hear them as much as we can. So thank you to that panel. I'd like to just very quickly wrap up with a preview of tomorrow. Let's see, Virginia, if you can unpin the panel, is that whatever the term is, and bring us back to the big screen. And I urge everybody to look at the chat, copy the chat, take it with you. It's really, really interesting and some very rich stuff. So back to gallery view, I hope. Good to see you all. I'm really impressed. We've hung on to a lot of people, almost all of our people that we started with. So tomorrow we plunge into the 50-year water plan. Rolf has got a presentation in the morning that will really give us a deep dive into that. We will then have a panel with John Fleck, Casey Ish, and Quantina Martin about water trade-offs among agriculture, municipalities, and the environment on the Rio Grande. And you'll have an hour and 15 minutes for lunch, and then at 1:15 come back. That is the time for table talks, breaking into small groups. It's going to be wild. We're going to have 17 groups, different topics, anywhere from 10 to 12, 14 people in a group. We'll come back and have a report out and then do some wrap up. So let me just turn it over to Virginia quickly if you want to just give a preview of how the breakouts will work.
Sure, thanks, Lucy. And before I dive into the breakouts and before we start losing folks, I just want to let you know that an email with the link for joining tomorrow should be sitting in your inbox. It just went out maybe 10 minutes ago or so, and we'll send it out again in the morning. But just be aware that to join tomorrow, it's a different link. It's a new link because it's a new Zoom meeting. So be sure and look for that link in your email. Let me know if you don't receive it for any reason. In terms of the breakouts, I'm sure many of you are familiar at this point how breakout groups work. Just as a quick reminder, when we are ready to go into breakout, you'll see a little window pop up on your screen inviting you to join your assigned group. And so just click yes, or I can't remember what it is, but join that group. We did our best to keep you in the groups that you either selected or requested, either directly through registration or through email. Some of you did not sign up for a group, and so you may or may not be assigned to a group. If you're not, there may be some people left in the main session, and you can create your own group discussion. And those of you who did not select a group but would like to be assigned to one, not a problem. We can send you to a room on the spot, probably fairly easily. We did decide in the initial invitation, we told folks that you'd be able to move around, and we changed our minds. And we thought that would make it tough on the facilitators, given how many of us are here, which is truly wonderful. And we also did not want to diminish the depth and focus of discussions. And so to that end, we asked that you stay in your breakout group for the duration. Lucy, I don't think you mentioned this, but the breakout rooms will be 45 minutes. Is that correct?
Yeah, 45, 50, maybe 50.
Okay.
But yeah, in that range.
And then after that, there will be time for, as Lucy mentioned, for a report back from each group. But we wanted to make sure that you had a good enough amount of time to really dive deep, but not so much that it feels overly, that it just feels like too much. So we think that time frame should be good.
Yeah, Virginia, I see that there's a comment from Kurt, quite right, that the agenda shows 11 groups. We didn't add any topics. We have 4 on the 50-year water plan, for instance, 4
Yes.
breakout groups, 2 great breakout groups on ag and rangeland. So the more popular ones got multiple groups. We did not add any topics.
That's right. There's just the 11 original topics, but 17 discussion groups with many focused on the water plan. If for some reason you feel that you've been assigned to the wrong group and you feel very strongly about being in a different group, just private message me and I'll do my best to switch you. Just have a little patience if that happens, because I might be pulled into a few different directions, but I'll do my best to get you where you really want to be. We want you to have a voice in the discussion that you want to participate in.
Great. I see.
Lucy?
Yeah, I see Daniel. If you could just communicate directly with Virginia in the chat there, she will respond. Okay, didn't mean to keep you late. Really appreciate everybody being here this morning. Have a very good rest of the day. Carry these messages, these thoughts that we've exchanged this morning, carry those with you into your day. And we will see you in the morning at 9 a.m. sharp, and we'll begin. Get ready for a wild ride. Thank you all.